Chapter 650. The news that Supreme Ting Feng, the master of heavenly book building, was cut out by the Night King of Western Continent with the Sword of Judgment in Immortal 7 area, and his crime was soon spread throughout the City of Immortals. For these speculators who had completely lost their bottom line, people naturally despised them. Wang Lu also took this opportunity to further strengthen his control of public opinion. He blamed the master of heavenly book building and the others for the consecutive defeats in the first month. If these people didn't secretly make their move, the Union of 10,000 Immortals would have just avoided the sharp edge and kept a low profile, and would not have been completely reduced to being beaten up. During this period, the many crimes of Supreme Ting Feng and his gang were constantly exposed, including designing traps for those loose cultivators, and even openly poisoning them so that they had a high chance of winning, but in the end they died tragically on the battlefield. Most of the 1-month losing streak was caused by these people. If this propaganda argument was seriously examined, it would naturally be untenable. The strength of those loose cultivators could be seen at a glance. Let alone holding them back, even if all the resources of the Wuxia League were assembled to carefully arm them, they would still be unable to escape death. At most, they could retain 1 or 2 points of dignity when they died. However, when the overall situation was absolutely unfavorable, they could only rely on this propaganda strategy to stabilize people's hearts as soon as possible. If people's hearts were unstable, it would be difficult for the Wuxia League, this huge and sophisticated organization, to exert its full strength. Especially for the large number of low-level cultivators, they were the most vulnerable, but their role was irreplaceable. For example, when Wang Lu developed the Wisdom Sect, he used the power of a large number of ordinary people to collect basic resources. Under the rule of the Wuxia League, thousands of foundation establishment and Shudan stage cultivators could also play a great role. Among other things, the female cultivators who gathered in B9 area these days had greatly eased the entertainment problem of the cultivators who were struggling in the front line. If these low-level cultivators lost confidence in the grand competition, the situation faced by the Wuxia League would only be worse. Therefore, even if he used deceptive means, Wang Lu insisted on carrying out the propaganda strategy to the end. Of course, with the passage of time, no one would become blind. Therefore, a few inspirational victories were imminent. Aya? Although I'm really sorry to bother you, I don't have too many suitable candidates except you. Aya smiled when she heard this. With our friendship, why do you say such polite words? As long as you need me, I can be your sword at any time. Heh, as expected of the righteous Night King. As Wang Lu spoke, he sighed deeply. Then I'll have to trouble you this time. The battle will be difficult, so don't force yourself. However, Aya slightly raised her eyebrows. If it's not difficult, then there's no reason for me to make a move. Don't worry, although Dixian is powerful, I still have a chance of winning. If I go all out, I have a 50% chance of winning against a Dixian like Shanimo. Wang Lu was simply amazed by Aya. Shanimo was indeed not the most powerful person in Dixian, but even the number 1 person in 9 regions, Supreme He too, didn't dare to say that he had a 50% chance of winning against her. The previous victory was purely because the opponent surrendered to him. This Aya really has a big tone. However, considering her consistent unwillingness to admit defeat and revolutionary optimism, it was not that Wang Lu couldn't understand her confidence. It was just that, if he really believed it and sent her to fight against a group of murderous Dixian, Wang Lu really couldn't do such a thing. However, if he directly refused Aya's kindness, it was easy to be misunderstood as looking down on her, which would then cause more trouble. Therefore, Wang Lu just patted her on the shoulder. When the time comes, I'll have to trouble you. Aya confidently puffed out her chest. Don't worry. Given that the Wuxia League was extremely eager for a victory in adversity, Wang Lu didn't let Aya wait too long. One day later, the battle to win began. Wang Lu took Aya all the way from Immortal 5 area to an arena in Human 3 area. According to the ranking of Immortal, Human, and Human, the Human area was not ranked high. Moreover, the standard of the arena was far less than that of the central arena in Immortal 1 area. Let alone the expansion of the space, it had a radius of thousands of miles. It was simply a spacious restaurant. She and Wang Lu stood in the hall of the restaurant. There were only 2 round tables in the large hall, surrounded by rows of bustling kitchens, and the aroma of the dishes assailed their nostrils. I was very confused. Wang Lu, are you sure we're not in the wrong place? Why do I feel that this place is not like a fighting arena? I said and then looked around. In the kitchens around the hall, there were no less than 200 chefs and several times more helpers. The kitchens were crowded. Some of them were cooking and some were stewing. The dishes they cooked were different, but they were equally focused and serious. However, these chefs were only at the level of ordinary people. In the context of the grand competition, they were as fragile as ants. Could it be that the difficulty this time is how to deal with the opponent without accidentally injuring the other party? Does it require very precise power control? Aya showed a slight embarrassment. But very well, in any case I will try my best. Wang Lu patted her on the shoulder and said, "You misunderstood. The reason why this place is not like a fighting arena is that it is not a place for fighting. This is a restaurant and there is only one purpose for coming here." With that, Wang Lu clapped his hands. Immediately, from the left side of the kitchen, several chefs dressed in white brought out a variety of delicious dishes, which filled the table. All this? Aya's eyes flashed involuntarily. Emerald star fish, grouper flower carved bamboo and crystal rice? These dishes were no less delicious than the immortal chicken and the emperor jar. Are these for me? Aya was lost in thought for a moment, and then shook her head vigorously. No, now is not the time to indulge in food. Although I am very grateful for your hospitality, I need to concentrate on dealing with the strong enemy before the big battle, so I can't be distracted by these pleasures. So, Aya swallowed with difficulty and then subconsciously reached out to the table and whispered, "It shouldn't be a problem if I just eat a snack. No, I am a knight who is about to enter the battlefield, so I have to." But some people say that proper nutrition before the battle is more conducive to victory. Seeing that Aya's inner struggle was almost about to split into two, Wang Lu, while holding back his laughter, reached out to pick up a wine immortal bag on the table, stuffed it directly into Aya's mouth, and then said in Aya's somewhat ashamed and angry eyes, "You can eat it boldly. This time, I invited you here to trouble you to eat to your heart's content." At the same time, in the hall of the restaurant, a figure appeared out of thin air in front of another round table. It was an extremely fat and burly man, more than 8 feet tall and almost the same width. This person's figure and appearance were very strange. His 2 legs were almost completely sunk into the fat that fell from his upper body. However, his 2 arms were slender and strong and his muscles were knotted. His shoulders were wide, and his arms hung down naturally, almost touching the ground. Compared to a human, he was more like a gorilla. And his face was also impressive. He had mung bean-sized eyes, a red nose and a big mouth that spanned the whole face from left to right. He looked 10% like a human and 90% like a ghost. After seeing this person, Wang Lu immediately cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, Food Immortal." The man named Food Immortal grinned and said, "You're too polite. This time, your Wuxian League has collected hundreds of ace chefs from 9 regions, which allowed this old man to have a feast. I should thank you first. However, is this the opponent you found for me? It's actually a Western continent girl?" Hehe, the Western continent does have all kinds of magical and mysterious places, which are not inferior to 9 regions. However, when it comes to food culture, it's not even worthy to carry our shoes. You found a Western continent person, do you want to give up and admit defeat? Wang Lu shook his head and said, "If I give up and admit defeat, there's no need for me to come out in person. I came here to win." Hehe, your tone is not small, but I don't know about your ability. With that, the Food Immortal narrowed his small eyes and carefully looked at Aya. Well, it looks like you're very strong. If we compete in fighting and killing, I'm afraid this old man will be scared witless. However, if we compete in eating, this old man has never lost. Hearing this, no matter how slow Aya was, she found the problem. Wait a minute, Wang Lu, do you want me to compete with him in eating? Wang Lu spread out his hands and said, "Didn't I give you a set of competition schedule before? In the cultural competition there is also a food competition." Aya was immediately annoyed and said, "This is ridiculous." Before Aya could finish, Wang Lu had pressed her arm hard and said, "Aya, I'm not trying to make fun of you. When it comes to the grand competition, no one can afford to make fun of you. I believe in your strength, that's why I brought you here." "But I'm a knight with a sword, so I should be on the battlefield," Wang Lu sternly said. "This is also a battlefield, no one will treat it as a child's play. And your opponent is a strong enemy worthy of you going all out. The Food Immortal is a Dixian who entered the Tao through food. Apart from you, I can't think of anyone who can compete with him in food. Please, I can't do without you here." Aya was silent for a moment and then nodded. "Very well, since you say so, then I'll compete. However, if the opponent is really that strong, I'm afraid." Aya was embarrassed to compete with people in a strange place outside the battlefield. Wang Lu reached out and hugged her, patted the girl's still delicate back and said, "I have absolute confidence in you." Aya's face was slightly red. She pushed Wang Lu away and then immediately restrained her expression. She sat in front of the round table and looked at the opposite Food Immortal. The girl had entered the state of the competition. Oh, that's a good momentum. The food immortal smiled indifferently and then asked Wang Lu, "Can the competition start?" Wang Lu nodded and said, "Let me introduce the rules of the competition first. This competition is the Great Gourmet Challenge, which is the quality of the two sides as gourmets. In a while, the chefs around you will serve you with food from all over the world for you to taste. These chefs are peerless chefs from all over 9 regions, and their cooking skills are beyond doubt. However, according to the requirements of the competition, there will be some flaws in every dish they make. Your task is to find out these flaws. Every time you find a flaw in a dish, you can get 1 point. If you choose less, you will get no points. If you choose wrong, you will lose 1 point. The first to accumulate 500 points wins." With that, Wang Lu looked at the food immortal and said, "Of course, due to the particularity of the competition, you can first confirm the chefs." However, the food immortal shook his head and said, "I've already confirmed that they all work independently and have not colluded with you. Otherwise I wouldn't be here. Well, since there's no other gossip to say, I'm going to eat." With that, he reached out and grabbed a piece of fat meat and put it into his mouth. "Aha, it's delicious. It's a pity that the heat is a bit off. This should be because the chef deliberately cooked it a bit longer, right?" Wang Lu smiled slightly and said, "Food immortal, you get 1 point first. After lying in bed for 2 days, I finally came back to my senses. I'll update this chapter first and then make it up on the weekend. By the way, it seems that there are still many people who don't know that the traditional Chinese version of Spirit Sword Mountain has been published. Friends in Taiwan can buy it in major bookstores. Not to mention, at least the cover quality is very good. Each episode also has an extra foreign story which can be regarded as a good deal. Those who are interested might as well join us." Chapter 651. How are we going to compete? It had only been a cup of tea's time since the start of the Gourmet Challenge, but Aya was already in chaos. She had never heard of this kind of competition. Finding the flaws deliberately left by the chefs in the dishes and accumulating the correct answer 500 times could win. The rules were not difficult to understand. What was difficult to understand was, what role could she play in this kind of competition? When it came to food tasting, she was also very experienced. After so many years in 9 regions, out of interest and hobby, she had tasted countless delicacies. To say that she was a food expert was indeed worthy of her name. However, the opponent was the food immortal. In just a cup of tea's time, the other party had gotten 8 points in succession. Most of the dishes could be tasted with just a touch of the tongue, and it was so accurate that it was unbelievable. Well, the shiitake mushrooms have been soaked for less time. Although it doesn't affect the taste, it's still a flaw. In addition, the water quality of the soup is also a bit heavy. It should be deliberately mixed with well water, right? It's not much, just 1 spoonful. Wang Lu nodded his head and said, "Food immortal, 1 more point." Hearing Wang Lu's report, Aya was even more at a loss. How could such a flaw be picked out? He was indeed the ancient food immortal. If it were her, Aya looked down at the fried pork on the plate. She had already eaten 1/3 of the dish, but she still couldn't judge where the flaw was. The taste seemed to be a bit heavy and the meat was a bit overcooked. However, Aya didn't dare to say that this was the flaw, because this was already the best piece of fried pork she had ever eaten. It was better than any experience she had ever had in 9 regions. According to a rough standard, it could be called flawless, so where could she find another one? While hesitating, the food immortal had completed the 10th appraisal. After reporting the flaw, the food immortal turned his head to look at Aya and then asked, "Are you sure you want to choose her as my opponent? She doesn't even know how to taste food. At most, she can only be called a diner. Compared with this waste, this old man's appetite will be gone." Then, ignoring Aya, whose cheeks were flushed with anger, the food immortal said to Wang Lu, "I think it's better for you to compete with me in person." Wang Lu smiled and said, "Me?" The food immortal stretched out his greasy finger and pointed to Wang Lu. "I heard that you are an all-round talent, and you have good attainments in any field. Moreover, in the past month we have won many battles. As the chief planner of the Wuxia League, you have been silent all this time. Today you suddenly appeared. You must be planning to win the next match to reverse the unfavorable situation of the Wuxia League. In this battle you can only win and not lose, so you should have the confidence to win. And this confidence can't be her, right?" After saying that, he took a sip of tea and said with a smile, "Moreover, how can you let a beautiful girl embarrass herself on the field while you watch from the sidelines?" When Wang Lu heard this, he couldn't help but sigh. "Senior food immortal, it seems that your big mouth is not only good at eating, but also good at sowing discord. That's right, if it's possible, I would also like to personally participate in the duel. Rather than placing my hopes on someone else, I might as well place my hopes on myself. And I have indeed put in a lot of effort into evaluating delicacies. Unfortunately, it is because of this effort that I know that it is impossible for me to compete with a master in this field. Food tasting requires talent, a love from the soul for food, not a simple sense of taste and smell. If it is a competition of theoretical knowledge, after special training, I am confident that I can compete with anyone, but what is the use of pure theory? A real master can surpass me with intuition, not to mention that there is a peerless master who uses the dining table as a battlefield and is invincible. The food immortal just chuckled. Wang Lu's unwillingness to accept the challenge was expected. Just now he invited Wang Lu to participate in the duel, just to shake Aya's confidence. However, soon the food immortal frowned. Because Aya, who was sitting on the opposite table, suddenly showed a look of realization, and then said, "This meat has a little more salt," and deliberately chose the wrong pig breed, resulting in a slight deviation in the meat quality. Wang Lu nodded. Aya gets 1 point. At this time, the food immortal suddenly came to his senses and immediately scolded himself for being muddle-headed. Why did he go and provoke Wang Lu? Just now, Wang Lu's words sounded like he was excusing himself for not participating in the duel, but in fact he was giving Aya some pointers, telling her the correct way to taste delicacies. Although he didn't know why they didn't prepare before the duel, but once the duel started, Wang Lu could not interfere with the duel for any reason, so it was naturally forbidden to remind her. However, just now he took the initiative to talk to him, so he immediately took the opportunity to tell Aya the key to the duel. However, that Western continent girl really had some skills. It could be seen that she actually had no experience in tasting, and her interest in food was limited to a hobby. Whether it was her knowledge or her means, they were very immature. But it was not easy to point out the defect of the fried pork in one sentence. Adding too much salt was actually a cover, the real difficulty was the meat quality appraisal. The extra salt just covered up part of the meat flavor, making it difficult to judge that the chef actually chose another kind of pork. It could be said that this was a trap carefully designed by the chef. Even he, the food immortal, smelled the taste through his sense of smell, and then used his immortal technique to restore all the taste of the dish. It took him a long time to restore the details. For a common gourmet, this was already an extremely difficult challenge. But for Aya to successfully break through the difficulty, was it because she was talented? Or, after a moment of astonishment, Aya had consecutively answered the flaws of the two dishes, both of which were correct. So fast. After Wang Lu's pointers, Aya seemed to have awakened. In an incomprehensible way, she quickly completed the tasting of all kinds of delicacies. Her speed was no different than that of the food immortal, and her accuracy was no different than that of the food immortal. Any food only needed to be touched on the tongue, and the good and bad would be clearly distinguished. The food immortal took a glance and was immediately dumbfounded. Because this was simply not reasonable. She did touch it with her tongue, but the place where she touched it was completely wrong. For example, just now she took the flaming turtle heart. The essence of the taste was at the tip of the heart. As long as one tasted the heart, one could have a comprehensive understanding of the whole dish. But Aya was tasting it in the opposite direction. Then she also gave the correct answer. The heart of the flaming turtle heart. When seasoning it, she deliberately added a trivial seasoning. Someone cheated. This was the first reaction of the food immortal because the scene in front of him was beyond his understanding. Of course, if it was him, let alone tasting it in the opposite direction, even if he didn't use his tongue, he could see the problem with his eyes. But he was the food immortal, what was Aya? However, in the end he did not accuse her of cheating because he was the food immortal, the food immortal. Not only was he the best food in the world, but his cultivation base was also earth-shattering. From the beginning to the end, he did not see where the two people cheated, and even if he wanted to accuse them, he could not. However, a moment later, a more outrageous scene appeared. In order to make up for the gap of nearly 10 points in the early stage, Aya began to speed up her tasting speed. She stretched out her chopsticks and picked up a fried eggplant box and then shook it in front of her mouth. Before her tongue could even stick out, she threw the eggplant box to the side and impatiently blurted out the answer, "The oil is wrong." Wang Lu immediately nodded. Aya scores. The food immortal slammed the table and stood up. However, the moment he stood up, he suddenly discovered one thing. Aya's concentration was unusual. Although her movements just now seemed a bit hurried, from the beginning to the end, the girl's eyes were shining, her breathing was steady, and her posture was focused as if she was facing an opponent worthy of her all out. If this was cheating, then her acting was way too realistic. But the path of food ultimately required skill and experience. How could she rely solely on concentration? Unless, suddenly the food immortal suddenly thought of a possibility. Could it be that she guessed it? A talented warrior could see the direction of the future from the chaotic environment in the battle, almost to the point of foresight. And Aya's posture at this time was indeed more like a warrior than a gourmet. So she could distinguish the quality of a dish without using her tongue? In theory it seemed to make sense, but was there really such a thing? And in the midst of his astonishment, the food immortal found that the gap between him and the other party was only 5 points. Forget it, now was not the time to pay attention to the other party. Since she had the ability to compete with him, the next step, he also needed to be a little more serious. After the food immortal became serious, his speed increased a bit, leaving Aya behind. Soon, in front of the food immortal, the first table of 30 dishes had been tasted. At this time, from a nearby kitchen, more than 10 chefs brought out 30 new dishes. The food immortal smoothly tasted the flaws of the first 15 dishes, but when it came to the 16th dish, the vinegar-sliced fish, Wang Lu shook his head. Unfortunately, you can't score. The food immortal was surprised. Can't score? According to the rules, if there were multiple flaws in a dish and not all of them were selected, then no points would be scored. In other words, he did not taste all the problems? Was it because after tasting more than 40 dishes in succession his taste buds were a bit numb? Or, the difficulty had already begun to increase imperceptibly? As a food immortal, the toughness of the Dishin's body was far from comparable to that of ordinary people. Even if the dishes were more stimulating, they could not numb his gourmet tongue. The only problem was that the difficulty had increased, and it was no longer possible to identify the flaws at will. So the food immortal immediately picked up a piece of fish and took a sip. Suddenly, there were some other things in his heart. In terms of taste alone, he did not intend to change his answer, but in places other than taste. The chef who made this dish is gloomy and depressed, which contaminated the dish. Wang Lu laughed. You are indeed worthy of being called the food immortal, you are right. The wife of the vinegar-sliced fish just died a few days ago. Unfortunately, this dish can no longer be scored. Please start to taste the next dish. The food immortal nodded and sighed in his heart. My goodness, this gourmet challenge is really interesting. The difficulty is getting higher and higher, gradually entering an unimaginable situation. After tasting more than 40 dishes, he was already asked to guess the mental health of the chef who made the dishes. If this continued, when it came to the 400th dish, would it involve the 18 generations of the chef's ancestors? However, the more it was like this, the more interesting the competition was. The food immortal looked at Aya on the opposite table, and the fighting spirit in his heart began to burn. Chapter 652. This dish of overwhelming sadness rice. In the hall of the restaurant, the bulky food immortal was sitting on a heavy stone block. His slender arms could easily reach any corner of the dining table. When Taotai was eating, his arms could sweep horizontally and vertically like a long whip, and dozens of dishes were swept away in an instant. But now, his two thick arms were carefully holding a porcelain bowl, motionless. The food immortal had a dignified look on his face as he stared at the bowl in his hand. His mouth constantly muttered strange syllables, and his throat rolled as he swallowed his saliva. After a moment, he slowly opened his mouth. The mood of the chef of this overwhelming sadness rice is indeed depressed and tormented, and it is layered on top of one another, making it memorable, but there is a glimmer of hope in the despair. This should be the highest realm of overwhelming sadness rice. Even if the immortal cooks, it is not easy to reach this realm. But after tasting it for a long time, this glimmer of hope contains a deeper madness, so that the mood of the whole bowl of rice has completely surpassed overwhelming sadness rice. If there is any flaw, this is the only flaw. Such a great work should not be bound in an ordinary framework. Wang Lu was silent for a moment, and then nodded seriously. Senior food immortal is really amazing. Such a difficult situation was solved by you. I simply want to give you 2 points. The food immortal put down the bowl, but was not in a hurry to taste the next dish. At this time, his points were close to 220 points ahead of Aya. Moreover, at this time, the taste of the dishes had become more and more difficult, and the time to solve the problem was getting longer and longer, so he was not in a hurry. The level of the dishes was getting higher and higher. The so-called flaws must first have a perfect standard would exist. And the standard of the simpler dishes may be very high but not so complicated. For example, a simple home-cooked dish should not be required to contain any deep and complex feelings. Perhaps there were brilliant chefs who could pour feelings into it, but that was just icing on the cake, not a necessary process. But if it was overwhelming sadness rice, if one could not understand the overwhelming sadness rice in the rice, then the rice could not be regarded as qualified. The same was true for deep as sea soup, 9 turn sorrow intestines, and so on. But to taste such dishes, more delicate effort was needed. In addition to the taste, one must also taste the feelings. The flaws in the dishes weren't so obvious. Instead, they were hidden well and craftily. In order to increase the difficulty of the competition, Wang Lu had also set up the order in which the dishes were served. Some dishes were almost flawless, while the dishes next to them were full of flaws. As many as 200 flaws were enough to make a dish difficult to swallow. But according to the rules, the food immortal had to endure the unhappiness and point out all the flaws one by one. Constantly switching his taste buds between dishes of different styles and accurately grasping the essence of each dish. It really made him, a food immortal, feel heavy. Although he had gotten close to 200 points, there were already 3 questions that he had missed out on. Just now, he almost couldn't find any flaws in the overwhelming sadness rice. I'm curious, how did this chef do it? Although the feelings it contains don't match the feeling of overwhelming sadness, it's still a rare delicacy. Being able to taste the flaws was certainly a skill, but the chef who could create such intricate flaws was also quite amazing. At least, the food immortal asked himself that if he didn't rely on his immortal cultivation base, he would never be able to pour such deep and complex feelings into a dish. But the chef who cooked that bowl of rice was just immortal. Wang Lu's eyes lit up when he heard this and smiled as if he had been looking forward to it for a long time. The unique emotion is, of course, based on his unique experience. I'll make a long story short. When he was young, he suffered a great misfortune, which led to the separation of his family, and his heart was like dead ashes. When he was middle-aged, his cooking skills had reached perfection, and he happened to meet a young girl with superb cooking skills. The two became husband and wife. His state of mind came back to life, but at this time, he found that his wife was his daughter who had been separated from him many years ago. The food immortal spurted out a mouthful of hot tea. No wonder in his bowl of rice, despair and hope are intertwined. But there is hope in the despair of his rice. Could it be that he wanted to hide his name with his wife from the world and not be found out? Wang Lu said, I also hope that things can go so smoothly, but unfortunately, after his wife learned the truth, she left a suicide note and disappeared from the world. The food immortal asked, so his only hope is to find his wife? But in his heart he felt that this was not a good choice. Sure enough, Wang Lu sighed. He did find his wife who lived in seclusion, but his wife chose to commit suicide when they met. They shouldn't have met. For him, isn't this completely hopeless? No, because his wife left behind a daughter before she died, who was his flesh and blood. Although it was a distorted bloodline, she was born like a jade carving, which was his only hope. The food immortal was silent for a long time. During this period, Aya had pulled back 5 points, but he didn't make half a move. Wang Lu, you are ruthless. After listening to your story, I couldn't eat for a quarter of an hour. Wang Lu said with a smile, Senior, please don't make a mistake, that is not my story, but the story of a poor person. I just dug it up and presented it. The food immortal sneered in his heart. Why didn't I see such a disgusting story appear on the opposite table? But on second thought, Aya only wanted to eat and never asked about the origin of the dish. She judged it based on her heaven-defying intuition. At this time, her heart was full of victory and defeat, and she didn't care so much about the story behind the food. But don't think that you can win like this, it's just an insignificant skill. Wang Lu smiled slightly. Insignificant skill? You misunderstood again, the insignificant skill is all in the back. In the front, we are having an upright competition. Unfortunately, it seems that I can't win against you. The food immortal coldly snorted, upright? You have no shame. You, this guy, are really the same as what Shen Mo and the others said, your lower limit is extraordinary. That Western continent woman analyzed the food as if it was an enemy. Although it was always successful in the competition, by the standards of a gourmet, it was simply a waste of God's gift. At least he was really tasting the wonderful food, but what about her? She didn't even touch the food on her tongue, so how could she taste it? As for the insignificant skill, if you have the ability, then use it. If he lost to anyone in food tasting, no matter what means the other party used, it would be the biggest joke in the world. Thinking of this, he carefully tasted dozens of dishes and accumulated 250 points. At this point, the competition was more than half over, and the difference between Aya and the food immortal had reached 30 points. Although Aya's intuition was sharp, it was not omnipotent. At this time, a considerable number of spectators had gathered outside the arena. Not only for the game itself, But more importantly, this was the first time that Wang Lu appeared in public since the nearly 100 consecutive defeats in the Wuxia League. The significance of this game was undoubtedly the horn of counterattack. It was just that, the contestant that Wang Lu bet on was not himself, but a Western continent woman who was still somewhat unfamiliar to many people. Many people in 9 regions were still unfamiliar with Aya's story, but after watching the first half of the game, many people were impressed by her. Although the score was still behind, it was already an extremely remarkable achievement to be able to follow closely behind the Food Immortal. Before the 100 consecutive defeats in the Wuxia League, almost all of them were one-sided crushing, whether it was civil or military. Dixian showed no mercy. Moreover, listening to Wang Lu's words, the situation would be more favorable in the second half? In other words, this game was really going to be won. But I think although that woman is powerful, there is still a gap between her and the Food Immortal. Although the gap is not big, the accumulation of 500 dishes, the final result is very impressive. Moreover, I can't see a turning point at all. Even such a tricky series of traps have been dealt with by the Food Immortal one by one. I can't imagine any problem that can trap him. While the crowd was talking about it, a new set of dishes was served on the Food Immortal's table. This time it was a little different from the previous one. The utensils were particularly exquisite, and the plate was also much more delicate. The Food Immortal's heart turned cold. He knew that the level of this food had been raised again. It had surpassed the general overwhelming sadness rice, and began to pursue the overall unity of color, fragrance, and emotion, which was also the highest realm of general food. At this point, the standard of food could be said to be infinitely high, and any slight deviation could be regarded as a flaw. Therefore he, the Food Immortal, had to take it seriously. The next moment, he wiped his hands on the hem of his clothes, took out a pair of bamboo chopsticks from his sleeve, held them with his right hand, and gently picked up a piece of raw fish in front of him. This was the first time that he used tableware, and his solemn posture was evident. In order to taste the highest level of dishes, he also took out the highest level of posture. However, a moment later he frowned. Because there were no flaws, no matter how he tasted, the fish in his mouth was perfect, and the plate was also impeccable. Could it be that this dish had no flaws? However, this did not match with the introduction of Wang Lu's question at the beginning. Or, in a table of imperfect dishes, being too perfect was a flaw? The Food Immortal began to hesitate. What he hesitated was not the judgment of a gourmet, but the necessary wisdom of a contestant. But at the same time, Aya did not hesitate to catch up with him. The difference in points went from 30 to 20, and then from 20 to 10, and finally she was going to keep pace with him. The Food Immortal finally couldn't bear it. He chose to believe in his judgment as a gourmet. This dish has no flaws. The next moment, he saw the smiling face of Wang Lu. Unfortunately, you answered wrong, so 1 point is deducted. This was the first time the Food Immortal made a mistake in the competition. It was not unexpected. The Food Immortal closed his eyes and asked, "What's wrong?" Wang Lu said, "There is a slight flaw in the plate decoration of this brocade dragon fish. Please pay attention to the poem on the plate." The Food Immortal took a look. On the exquisite plate, there was indeed a well-known 7-character quatrain, which was a famous poem that he, the Dixian, had read. "What's wrong with this poem?" Wang Lu smiled. "Please pay attention to the third word on the second line. It's a typo. Working overtime for the whole morning is really miserable. P.S. Please follow the WeChat official account, search for His Majesty the King, and there will be new activities from time to time. P.S.S. The traditional version of the novel has been published in Taiwan. Friends from the other side are welcome. On the mainland you can find Taobao to buy, the quality is reliable." Chapter 653. Typo? When he heard this answer, the Food Immortal inconceivably turned his eyes back to the plate, carefully observed the third word on the second line, and then finally found that in the extremely complex structure of the word, a horizontal line was added without anyone noticing. It was actually an exaggeration to say that no one noticed it. With the eyesight of an Earth Immortal, they would not miss even the slightest detail at a glance. But who would seriously look at the decorative poem on the plate to see if there were any typos when they were wholeheartedly tasting the food? However, it was not far-fetched to say that this was a flaw. As a part of the decoration, this famous poem did have the effect of setting off the atmosphere of the entire dish. If there was an oversight in the text, it would make the perfect dish appear regretful. As the Food Immortal, he should not have such an oversight, but the design of Wang Lu's question was too ingenious, and just aimed at his weakness. He could not help but think of more than 18,000 years ago when he first entered the Tao through food. his master who guided him into the Tao once said a sentence. Although the Tao of food is a different path, if you want to achieve great success in this Tao, you must learn from the strengths of many Taoists and master them thoroughly. You are lively and full of spiritual energy, but you hate reading and writing the most. I'm afraid that in the future, you will suffer because of your lack of culture. 2,000 years later, he achieved great success in his cultivation method, cast the body of Dixian, and entered the Tao through food and was close to ascending. His master's words had long been thrown to the back of his mind. He was just a Yuanying stage cultivator, and his vision was far less than his own. What value could his insights and messages have? Culture? How many spirit stones were they worth? A few pieces of fat meat? At this time, thinking of this, the food immortal could not help but be silent. Master, I can't believe that you, with your mere Yuanying stage cultivation base, could really see through the future thousands of years later. I have always regarded myself as the food immortal, but unexpectedly I still suffered a loss because of culture. Okay, you win. The food immortal gritted his teeth and finally admitted it. At the same time, there were thunderous cheers from the audience. Because at this time, Aya had successfully got 251 points, just 2 points ahead of the food immortal. It only took Aya a moment to see the flaws in the same type of dish, and it was not difficult to see from her calm eyes. Wang Lu did not reveal the topic in advance. In fact, Wang Lu did not tell Aya that he was going to participate in the gourmet appraisal competition before today. But Aya was undoubtedly an excellent gourmet connoisseur. With her evildoer-level intuition on the battlefield, as well as the necessary knowledge as a gourmet, her performance was only slightly inferior to that of the food immortal. In the open and above-board first half of the match, although she did not have the upper hand, she kept up with Wang Lu. However, in the second half of the match, when Wang Lu began to be shameless, Aya's advantage became obvious. As a scholar of the Western continent, her level of education was enough to compete with a top student like Wang Lu. Moreover, she also had the characteristics of a woman's meticulous mind. At a glance, she could see the flaws in the poem on the plate, which formed an unusually sharp contrast with the food immortal. However, I'll only be able to use this little trick once. The food immortal was fooled once, but he would not be fooled a second time. He just didn't like to read, but he was not illiterate. If he carefully looked at the wrong words, he could always see it. What's more, in the gourmet appraisal, decoration was only one part of it. As long as his basic skills were still solid, this competition was still within his grasp. This confidence lasted until he turned his attention to the next dish. The same pattern, the edge of the exquisite plate, was printed with the same exquisite ancient poem. The food immortal frowned and found that there were a lot of words that he didn't recognize. Damn it, aren't you too ruthless? Those ancient poems were truly ancient poems. For Dixian, who achieved enlightenment 18,000 years ago, they were also ancient poems that needed to be traced back. Many of the words were simply ancient characters, which had long been abandoned. However, with this 10,000-year-old mountain grass dipped in sauce, it could set off the exuberance of the ancientness. It was hard to say what was wrong with this plate presentation. However, it didn't matter if he didn't recognize the words. The competition didn't require him to pick out which word was wrong. It was enough as long as he answered that there was a typo in the poem. However, at this moment, the food immortal's heart trembled, and then he scolded, "Wang Lu, you are really a bitch." Wang Lu was still smiling. "Senior, why do you say that?" The food immortal angrily spat out a grain of sand from his mouth. "There is sand in this mountain grass." Wang Lu said, "Oh, congratulations on finding the problem, senior. Then do you want to confirm the answer?" Confirm the answer? The food immortal wanted to punch his head. If there was no sand, he could certainly confirm that the only flaw was in the poem. Because the mountain grass itself was perfect, the sauce was fresh and simple, and the aftertaste was endless. The decoration of the plate was just right. The only thing that could go wrong was that there was a typo in the poem. But now with this grain of sand, he couldn't confirm it. Because there may be two flaws or there may only be one. A gourmet appraisal competition could actually play such a game of scheming. The food immortal simply admired it. But as a contestant, he was boiling with anger. This was not a gourmet appraisal at all, it was purely a vicious game of intrigue and trickery. In any case, what is your answer? Wang Lu unhurriedly asked and then turned his head to look at Aya. Faced with the same type of question, Aya pondered for a moment and then gave the answer. There is a typo in the third line of the ancient poem. The food immortal fiercely gritted his teeth. She is a Western continent person, how could her attainment in ancient characters be deeper than mine? No matter how much I don't like to read, I have put in a lot of effort to read ancient books and records. Wang Lu, however, smiled slightly. When Aya came to 9 regions, she was unfamiliar with the people and the place. She was focused on finding the way to win the war. During this period, she spent more than just time reading ancient books. At this time, the score gap between Aya and the Food Immortal had reached 3 points. The Food Immortal finally opened his mouth. My answer is that there is sand in the mountain grass, that's all. Wang Lu nodded and said, a wise choice. Unfortunately, you can't score. If he chose to answer a flaw, the worst-case scenario would be that he would not get any points, but if he guessed wrong, he would lose points. Wang Lu was indeed a master of psychological warfare. However, it was still the same sentence: the Food Immortal would not eat the same loss twice. After tasting the 10,000 years old mountain grass, the Food Immortal simply stopped and took out a book from his sleeve. It was an ancient dictionary that his master personally passed on to him 18,000 years ago. Alas, I should have listened to master's words and memorized all of this book, the Food Immortal said, swept his eyes, closed his eyes for a moment, and then put away the book. With the strength of Dishen's primordial spirit, memorizing a dictionary was just a blink of an eye. Then he spent the time it took to drink a cup of tea to memorize 2 dictionaries and more than a dozen anthologies of ancient poems. Although he still lacked a deep understanding and it was impossible for him to create any famous poems, it was not to the point where he couldn't even recognize the typo in the poem. At this time, Aya's points were nearly 10 points ahead of him, but if the Food Immortal wanted to catch up, it would be very fast. There was still half of the competition and he had a lot of opportunities. And with Wang Lu's insignificant skill, what else could it be? Thinking of this, his eyes turned to the next dish: fallen leaves to find the root, a cold dish with the roots of an ancient tree as the main ingredient. It was also of high value, no less than the 10,000 years old mountain grass. Moreover, this dish also contained a special artistic conception, and the standard was very high. The Food Immortal's small eyes narrowed slightly, thinking in his heart that this time, there would most likely be poems about homesickness as decoration, but the relevant poems had all been memorized by him. Even if Wang Lu came up with more tricks, he was not afraid. However, when he looked closely, the Food Immortal found that there was no poem on the plate, only a string of seemingly inexplicable characters. X equals, B plus or minus, B caret 2-4 AC, caret 12? 2A. What the hell is this? The Food Immortal thought for a long time, but he could not determine the meaning of this string of characters. He only felt that this seemingly simple line of characters contained an awe-inspiring magical power, and after looking at it for a long time, he would feel dizzy. The Food Immortal then turned his attention back to the dish itself. He used chopsticks to pick up the plump roots soaked in mountain spring water. Sure enough, he found a flaw. The next question was, how many flaws did this dish have? What exactly was that scribbled character? Was there a flaw in it? However, after searching his memory, the Food Immortal did not remember seeing such a thing. But to say that Wang Lu deliberately used some new things that were born during his 16,000 years of sleep to make things difficult for him, it was absolutely impossible. At this time, among the onlookers, there were not only the cultivators of the Wanxian League, but also the companions of Dixian. If Wang Lu openly cheated, someone would definitely jump out to interfere, but obviously there was no one. So, the problem was exactly the same as the previous dish. Could he only rely on guessing? The Food Immortal sighed with emotion. He was far from having the intuition to predict the future. He could not be like the Western Continent girl who could rely on guessing to guarantee a 99% accuracy rate. There are 2 flaws in this dish. One is the wrong handling of the roots, and the other is, there is a mistake in this scribbled character. Wang Lu smiled again and said, unfortunately, I have to deduct 1 point from you. The formula for finding the roots is correct. Isn't the beauty of mathematics very touching? The Food Immortal smiled lightly, but his right hand forcefully broke the chopsticks that had been with him for many years. Mathematics. It was actually a mathematical formula. F*CKU. What I hate the most is mathematics. Isn't it enough to count the numbers and do the basic 4 operations? Why do you need such complicated mathematical tools? At the same time, looking at the remaining dozens of dishes on the table, as well as the variety of designs on the plate, the heart of the Food Immortal had already begun to waver, and his belief of winning was gone. Strictly speaking, Wang Lu blindly made a fuss on the plate, which had fallen into a bad position. But this was a competition of points, not a competition of culinary appreciation. Even if Wang Lu's means were despicable and shameless, as long as it was still within the framework of the rules, it was beyond reproach. He could only endure it. Who told him to be full of confidence and take the initiative to fight? His state of mind was in chaos and his appetite also disappeared. The food immortal was silent for a moment. Seeing that Aya's score had surpassed him by more than 20 points, enough, this old man will not compete anymore. The food immortal stood up from the stone stool with an ashen face, flicked his sleeves and left. Outside the arena, cheers shook the sky. Chapter 654. Phew, are you okay? In the lounge of the restaurant, Wang Lu kindly and considerately gave the victorious hero a cup of cold water and a sweet wine to restore physical strength and energy. Aya, who was sweating, nodded wearily. She washed her hands in the basin and took the cup of sweet wine, but her wrist couldn't help but shake, and her fingers were powerless, causing the cup to fall. Wang Lu reached out and caught the cup, brought it to Aya and fed it to her. A moment later, the girl's pale cheeks showed a hint of redness, and her blurred eyes recovered a bit of clarity. That was close. If he hadn't given up halfway, I would have almost been unable to hold on. Aya shook her head, quite dissatisfied with her own weakness. It seems that my cultivation is still not enough. Wang Lu said, don't be too harsh on the winner. That's a well-known behavior, my 100-people slayer girl. The competition between you and the food immortal relied on intuition rather than skill. You had to use all your concentration to make predictions for each dish, and the consumption was no less than an evenly matched battle. But you were able to fight more than 280 times in a row. This tenacity is second to none among the supreme. Aya said, but the final victory is still thanks to your arrangement. Wang Lu took the empty cup handed by Aya, turned around and took 2 sparkling and translucent immortal fruits for her. I was worried that you would be dissatisfied with this despicable plot. Aya said, although I dislike despicable and shameless things, all of your arrangements are within the rules. It can only be said that all is fair in war, and the sword is unconventional. I don't reject this and even enjoyed fighting with such an opponent. However, this kind of victory is only once. Next time, the opponent will be more cautious and will not leave any opportunities. Wang Lu said, it doesn't matter. In the next round, I will use my strength to crush them. Aya ate the fruit while looking suspiciously at Wang Lu. Fair and square, crushing him with strength? This sentence doesn't fit the current you at all. Dead face, look what I brought back today. In Zone A17, a healthy young man was carrying 2 food boxes in his hands as he excitedly kicked over the door of a certain house. Behind the door, in the dark environment, 2 dark green eyes opened. Then a hoarse and stiff voice sounded, "Little mouse, I warned you, don't destroy my door again. Haha, don't be so inflexible. Today I'm returning from a rewarding journey. The Full Mountain Red restaurant in the Human 5 area is giving away the best dishes for free. I risked my life to help you snatch 2 boxes of food from a group of cultivators. They are definitely good stuff, completely incomparable to the stuff that automatically generates in this room every day." As he spoke, Shu Si opened the lunchbox, allowing the refreshing aroma of the dishes to spread out. Haha, what do you think? Doesn't it feel good? Don't pull a long face. If you want to drool, just drool. Don't worry, it's not stolen. It's really a big gift from the restaurant. It said that Wang Lu and Dixian competed in food tasting. In the end, Wang Lu was forced to admit defeat before the competition was over. These dishes were originally intended for them to taste, but now they can only be given away for free. After listening to Shu Si's explanation, the dead face said, "You mean Wang Lu made his move?" While eating the snacks, Shu Si vaguely said, "He didn't do it himself. He found a Western continent god of war. It said that she's a woman, but she has the strength of a supreme. The cultivators around me just said it casually and I don't really understand it. But in short, Wang Lu won. Now everyone is celebrating the victory and many shops are offering discounts. But my capital is limited, so I can't afford it." After a while, seeing that the dead face didn't respond, Shu Si asked again, "But is it necessary to be so happy? He only won 1 game and it's just a trivial food tasting competition which only gives him 20 points. Not long ago he lost a martial arts competition and his points are more than 50. The dead face coldly said, "Ignorant kid. This victory is just the beginning, it's the foreshadowing of Wang Lu before the decisive battle." Foreshadowing before the decisive battle? Shu Si puffed his cheeks and looked puzzled. "Humph, it's useless to explain to you. Next, Wang Lu will continue to repeat small victories like today. He won't appear himself, but he will push the people around him to the stage one by one, and without exception he will win. If you like, you can take advantage of this to get some benefits, but those are not important. Little mouse, remember, if there's news that Wang Lu is going to fight in person, you must inform me in time. It doesn't matter what I'm doing at that time. But if you forget, I will let you taste the pain." Shu Si trembled. Hey 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 Deadface, we're so familiar with each other, do you really need to threaten me? When did I fail to do what you asked me to do? I know, as long as Wang Lu makes his move I will inform you, right? Tiske, I can't believe that you usually pretend to be an otherworldly expert, but you're actually Wang Lu's diehard fan. Renjia is young enough to be your... Before he finished speaking, Shu Si felt his tongue go numb, and he couldn't say a word. This was one of the most common tricks of Deadface when he was noisy. He grinned and made a face. He didn't care and began to concentrate on enjoying the food in front of him. Deadface was not in a hurry to eat. In fact, Shu Si had never seen him really in a hurry to do anything. Instead, he fiddled with a string of copper coins in his hand. Shu Si suddenly became interested. After living with this Deadface for so long, he had long known that this was his divination trick, but he didn't know how accurate it was. Because he never told him what he was divining, but Shu Si was still very interested in the results of his divination. He saw Deadface throw the copper coins into the air one by one and catch them again. He did it 9 times in a row and all of them were heads. Shu Si watched with relish, but at the 10th time, Deadface covered the result with his hand, not letting Shu Si see it. Hey, you're too stingy. The young man shook his head in disappointment, and then fiercely stuffed the last piece of immortal grass-fried cake in the food box into his mouth, not leaving a piece for Deadface. At the same time, in the Immortal 5 area, there was a new guest in the courtyard belonging to the chief planner of the organizing committee. Senior brother, long time no see. A soft girl in a rainbow-colored dress sweetly called out to senior brother at the entrance of the courtyard. That kind voice made the beautiful landscape of the courtyard seem a bit gentler. Under the mottled shadow of the trees, in the exquisite house, Wang Lu slowly pushed the door open and greeted her with a smile. Little Luli, long time no see. You've lost a lot of weight. Fortunately, you haven't lost weight where you shouldn't. The next moment, a cloud of colorful clouds floated in front of him, and Luli stepped in front of him, pulled his sleeve and said with shining eyes, Senior brother, you said in the letter that you can take me to eat for a day and a night, is that true or false? Wang Lu touched her head and said, When did I lie to you? Upon hearing this, Luli was startled and then counted with her fingers. The first time was in the final battle of the sex competition, the second time was in the training field of the cloud platform, and the third time was... Well, don't count, I've sinned so much that I deserve to die 10,000 times over. But this time I really didn't lie to you. The owner of the Full Mountain Red restaurant in Human 5 area just gave me 2 lifetime free meal vouchers, so I can go there at any time to order at will. I think you've been training hard with the others in Royal Soldier Sect recently, so your daily 3 meals must be very simple, so I called you here to improve your meals. Aha, I know senior brother is the best to me. Luli said and immediately rushed over. Her movement was as fast as lightning, causing Wang Lu, a cultivator of non-phase method, to stagger back. If it weren't for the cushion in front of his chest, he would have most likely suffered some trauma. Wang Lu hugged his cheerful and lively junior sister. Inwardly, he was a little surprised by her unusual speed. I haven't seen you for a while, but you've really progressed by leaps and bounds. As soon as the words came out of his mouth, he saw Lu Li's bitter face. Senior brother, you've said it. During this period of time, we've been tortured by those perverted old men of Royal Soldier Sect. Every day from morning to night, we didn't stop for even a moment. Moreover, from time to time, we were forced to drink those sticky nutrient solutions by them. Wait a minute, it's indeed a good thing that you can still be so lively when other people can't even speak. But, who taught you to use these obscene words to summarize the training life? Luli blinked her beautiful big eyes. 5th martial ant. She taught me to say that, saying that when I meet people later I should say that, so that the people of Royal Soldier Sect would panic and run to me, and then I could put forward my conditions. Damn it, that bitch. Forget all the nonsense she taught you and then come with me to eat. Okay. Upon hearing about food, Luli immediately threw her 5th martial ant to the back of her mind and completely forgot about it. Come, this is the overwhelming sadness rice that even the food immortal praised. Try it and see how it tastes. Luli's face was full of expectation. She couldn't wait to dig a spoonful of it and put it into her mouth. The next moment, the girl's charming smile collapsed and tears flowed out in an instant. Oh, senior brother, I remember the experience of the training. Every day is so hard. Wang Lu also sighed with emotion. The hell training of Royal Soldier Sect was very famous. If 1 out of 10 people could persist until the end, that would already be considered good. Although this time they were trained by the elites of 9 regions, the elimination rate was also quite amazing. In the past few months, there had been substitutes being selected and the main team being eliminated. Even the lead disciples of the 5 uniques, such as Zhang Zai and Zhou Mumu, had a hard time. Only Qiong Hua and Xiang Liang were relatively relaxed, while Lu Li was slightly inferior to the lead disciples of the 5 uniques. At this time it was really not easy for her to just complain about the hard work. Then he heard Lu Li cry out, "Royal Soldier Sect doesn't give us enough to eat at all. They said that they want us to survive in the extreme and so on. Moreover, every time the food they eat is also very bad. I secretly hid something but I would be scolded by their officers. I haven't eaten such delicious food for a long time." Upon hearing this, Wang Lu almost burst into tears. "So this is all your hard work?" "Okay, I know. During this time, you can eat here with peace of mind. Eat as much as you want, because in 2 days, you will experience something more cruel than the training of Royal Soldier Sect." Chapter 655. Senior brother, you don't have to say any more, I know it in my heart. Under the mottled shadow of the mottled tree, the junior sister and junior brother under the tree looked tranquil. The junior sister raised her head. Facing the moonlight, her delicate little face looked even more white like jade, perfect and flawless. It was just that, her long eyelashes trembled slightly, showing that her heart was extremely shaken. Alas, after all, this is a major event related to the whole of 9 regions. You, me and no one can be alone. Although I can't bear it, I have to let you reluctantly. It doesn't matter. Master told me that senior brother will never harm me. She told me to listen to you in the future. Whatever you say, I will do it. So, in the next match I will go all out. The girl said. Her eyes gradually became firm, and a sword-like cold light appeared in her clear eyes. Very well. Wang Lu didn't say much. Saying more would just be pretentious. 2 days ago he sent a letter to invite Lu Li from Royal Soldier Sect. Wasn't it just to let her appear in the match? Wasn't the feast in the Full Mountain Red restaurant just a farewell banquet? 1 day later, Wang Lu would once again fight against Dixian in the Full Mountain Red restaurant. It was also a food item in the cultural competition, and also a test for the diners. However, it did not require the diners to be picky, but to see the diners' endurance. The opponent was also the food immortal, but the general that Wang Lu was going to send was not Aya, who had the power of supreme level and had defeated the food immortal once, but the unknown king pill cultivator Lu Li. It was just that, the difficulty of this match was actually higher than the previous one. In the last match, after Aya defeated the food immortal, she was only exhausted, but in this match, regardless of the outcome, the contestants might be left with a psychological shadow. Wang Lu usually doted on Lu Li the most, so he really couldn't bear to let her make this kind of risk and even sacrifice. However, there were too many benefits in sending her out, so there was really no more choice. First, in this fight, Lu Li's special physique was too suitable. In the entire Wanxian League, there were less than 5 people who were more suitable than her. Secondly, letting Lu Li experience this bitter battle could show the selflessness of Wang Lu as the chief planner, thus further quelling the noise of public opinion. Third, Lu Li's state of mind was clear, so it was difficult to leave behind a real psychological shadow. Even if she suffered any injury, it would be easy to recover. Fourthly, it has been a long time since we last met. I do miss you a little. Finally, after touching Lu Li's head, Wang Lu took a deep breath. His mind had already begun to calculate the various arrangements for tomorrow's match. If I want to win, I'll have to borrow the strength of another person besides Lioli. However, it would be a great sin to cause her psychological trauma, so I'll have to seriously consider what I'm going to say. Well, that's right. This battle is of great importance and we need the media to promote it. After the building master of the Heaven Book building stepped down, I have the ability to use the media resources. The next day there was a sea of people outside the Full Mountain Red restaurant. The number of spectators who came to the restaurant was more than 100,000. For a peripheral event that was scheduled to be held in the human area, this was already the limit of the popularity that could be reached. No matter how many people there were, this area could not accommodate it. The spectators outside the venue had already pulled up the banners, and the flowers and fireworks were even more layered, making the Full Mountain Red restaurant worthy of its name. Many of the spectators who were closest to the restaurant came a few days in advance, in order to seize the favorable terrain and watch Wang Lu up close. Although everyone knew that Wang Lu would not participate in the match, being able to watch his heroic appearance as the host of the match was enough to make many enthusiasts deeply satisfied. Nowadays, Wang Lu's popularity was so high. Not only was he popular among the cultivators below the level of King Pill, but he was also quite popular among many Yuanying and deity stage seniors. Before the start of the match, the most influential newspaper reporter under the banner of the mysterious Sky Mansion, a fair-skinned young cultivator, came to the entrance of the restaurant first through the teleportation formation in the building. He began to record the grand occasion and interviewed the spectators one by one. At present, there are still 2 hours before the start of the match, and the surroundings of the venue are completely crowded. It is said that the price of the seats closest to the hall has risen to more than 10,000 spirit stones in the black market, and there is no market for it. Those who have occupied the seats are not willing to sell them at all, so the price is really amazing. Then, these spectators who came here in advance and are closest to the venue undoubtedly made a lot of money. Next, I will interview them for everyone. Hello. Are you here to watch the match? The reporter held a pen and paper in his hand and asked an old man at the front of the line. The old man raised his head and glanced at him. Aren't you talking nonsense? If I'm not here to watch the match, then am I here to buy breakfast? Although the old man's tone was fierce, the young man was surprised when he saw him. Ancestor Yenha? Why are you here? Are you also here to watch Wang Lu's match? Suddenly, there was a burst of exclamation from all around. Ancestor Yenha was a well-known senior in deity stage. His middle-level deity stage cultivation base made it difficult for him to display his invincible might in this grand competition. However, in the past he single-handedly strangled the 7 great devils on the bank of Yen River, which shocked 9 regions. Such a senior was actually a fan of Wang Lu? Had Wang Lu's popularity reached this point? Humph, who has the mood to watch the performance of a junior? I'm here for my granddaughter. Ancestor Yenha said with a helpless face. That girl has been in closed-door training for the past few days and can't come out, so I have to ask for her signature. Really, she doesn't care about the calligraphy of me, a dignified Taoist master of deity stage, but instead she keeps thinking about that King Pill kid. She really lost her grandfather's face. With that, Yenhe was so angry that he directly turned his back to the young reporter and no longer paid attention to him. The reporter held back his laughter and turned his attention to the others. Excuse me, are you all here to watch the competition? The 5 girls who were interviewed laughed in unison and said, We are all here to cheer for Wang Lu. Wang Lu, we will always love you. The reporter said, I believe that Taoist Master Wang Lu can feel the warm support from the audience and will be deeply moved. However, the contestant for today's competition is someone else, so let's also bring our blessings to him. Well, with this opportunity, do you have anything to say to Wang Lu? Whether it's blessings or expectations. One of the girls boldly said, Wang Lu, I want to give birth to your child. The reporter smiled bitterly and was about to speak when he heard the sarcastic voice of another group of girls not far away. You little bee asterisk teach who wants to eat swan meat. The girl in front of him also heard it clearly and immediately became angry. You are the little bee asterisk teeth, your whole family are little bee asterisk cheese. The group of fans on the opposite side was also not polite. Little bee asterisk teeth, you are not convinced? Do you think you are qualified to touch Wang Lu? You are not even qualified to lick his shoes. You are not the same species at all, I'm afraid there is reproductive isolation. The girl who was scolded was furious. I'm going to fight you. Seeing that there was going to be a riot at the entrance of Full Mountain Red, the reporter's eyes lit up. He quickly picked up his pen and wrote at a fast speed. He also took out the video equipment and prepared to record this scene faithfully. But very quickly, the reporters realized that the sea of people surrounding Full Mountain Red had suddenly set off a shocking wave of cheers. From the outside to the inside, from far to near, the cheers came wave after wave and it was deafening. The reporter clearly heard that it was tens of millions of people shouting the same name in unison. Wang Lu. Wang Lu. Wang Lu. Wang and Lu, these 2 syllables were like the peaks and troughs of waves, surging in layer upon layer, which could not help but sweep people away and lose their direction. Many of the audience, who were originally calm, were ignited by the atmosphere and shouted one after another, blending into the atmosphere. Seeing this scene, the reporter's heart was filled with emotion. A young King Pill who had been cultivating for less than 30 years could actually gain such a high reputation in a place like the City of Immortals. Such a thing was probably rare in the history of the entire 9 regions. Of course, there were many people who were more powerful than Wang Lu when they were young. Immortal Qin, from his cultivation to his ascension, traveled the world for 20 years. At his peak, a cup of immortal tea made all the heroes helpless. However, even if it was immortal Qin, it was absolutely impossible for him to accomplish so many great feats at the core formation stage. No matter how much controversy Wang Lu was still carrying at this time, anyone had to admit that the Wanxian League was now inseparable from him. When the reporter thought of this, he sighed softly and added a few more strokes to the paper. At this moment, although it is only the beginning of a marginal competition with less than 10 points, I think I am witnessing the opening ceremony of a new era. Haha, thank you all for coming here. Amidst the cheers, Wang Lu leisurely landed from midair and constantly waved to the audience around him. Then, from time to time, he took out a stack of signed photos from his mustard seed bag and threw them down, which caused a commotion among the girls below. Beside him, Lu Li, dressed in a colorful dress, squatted on her flying sword and looked at the fanatical tide below with interest. "Senior brother, are they here to cheer for me?" Wang Lu said with a smile. "Who among them knows you?" "Of course they're all here to cheer for me. Speaking of which, seeing that I have so many female fans, do you have any thoughts?" "Well, no." Lu Li asked curiously, "What should I think?" "Well, it's right for you to think so now. You don't need to be distracted by other things except for the competition. Just wait for a while. Remember what I said?" Lu Li nodded. "As long as you enjoy the food, you don't need to care about anything else." "Yes, enjoy it as much as you can." Wang Lu patted the girl's shoulder and then landed on the ground with her. The moment their feet landed in front of the Full Mountain Red restaurant, the surging crowd automatically separated, revealing a spacious passage that led straight to the restaurant's entrance. Behind the door was the familiar bright hall, which was hung with a banner written by the owner of the Full Mountain Red restaurant. A warm celebration of the dark cuisine competition held in the Full Mountain Red restaurant. At the same time the door opened, a strange smell that made one's internal organs tremble wafted out from the kitchens around the hall. Amway Spirit Sword Mountain's traditional Chinese book. It has been published in Taiwan for a long time. If you are interested, you might want to take a look. Each episode has 150 to 200,000 words, and there are exclusive short stories, which generally introduce the behind-the-scenes glorious deeds of the main characters. At the same time, the cover of the novel is quite exquisite. Especially the 7th episode, the cover character is the Stellar Fairy, which is very worth looking forward to. Chapter 656. After the door of Full Mountain Red was opened, the banner hanging in the hall fell into the view of the other spectators, which immediately triggered a lot of discussion. Dark cuisine competition? What's that? Did the previous competition schedule mention it? An older cultivator who was more familiar with the situation shook his head. The previous explanation materials did not give a detailed explanation of the rules of each competition. But I remember that among the several sub-events of the food competition, one of them seems to test the tolerance of the contestants. Speaking to this, the strange smell from inside the door came into his nose. The older cultivator's face suddenly changed and he could no longer speak. Fortunately, he was, after all, a cultivator. He circulated the magical power in his body and swept away the feeling of annoyance. Then, he stiffly said, "I now begin to suspect that the rumor that Wang Lu and Lu Li have a good relationship may not be accurate. Being able to ruthlessly let their junior sister participate in this competition, I think they are more like enemies." At the same time, a considerable part of the audience closest to the hall retreated with livid faces, willing to give up the position worth 10,000 spirit stones. The smell in the restaurant was really strange. It was not a foul smell but a strange and indescribable odor. At the same time, every inch of their body was strongly resisting and rejecting the smell. It's like putting all the inedible things in the world into a pot and cooking them. However, although this smell could make the audience retreat, it could not stop Wang Lu and Lu Li, who had already made up their minds to fight. The two of them walked into the restaurant hand in hand. As the host of the competition, Wang Lu stood in the middle of the hall. Lu Li consciously sat in front of a round table, ready to fight. The next moment, a fat figure appeared out of thin air in front of the opposite round table. It was the food immortal who came directly to the venue with a teleportation spell. The defeat a few days ago seemed to have been completely ignored by him. The fat food immortal appeared in front of Wang Lu with a smile, but the next moment, the smile froze on his face. What is this smell?" Wang Lu shrugged. "Of course it's the smell of wine, meat, and food." The food immortal shouted, "When you say that, take off the mask that covers your mouth and nose." Wang Lu coughed. "Sorry, I have a cold. I don't want to infect anyone." "You were just talking and laughing with your fans?" The food immortal mercilessly exposed him. "Yeah, I was infected by the passionate people at that time." Wang Lu insisted on being shameless. "Forget it, I don't have time to waste with you. I remember you said that the theme of today's competition is to compete on food intake. What's with this dark cuisine competition?" Wang Lu said, the purpose of the competition hasn't changed. It's still a competition of food intake. However, there were many explanations for the amount of food one could eat. If it was purely about quantity, it would be a waste for both gourmets and gourmets. Because in this kind of competition, no one would care about the taste of the food itself. It would be like stuffing a duck with no sense of beauty. Therefore, the amount of food consumed in this competition is more about one's tolerance and capacity. The food immortal said, "What you said is somewhat reasonable, but how do you explain the words dark cuisine? What about the disgusting smell in the kitchen? What does it have to do with your tolerance and capacity?" Wang Lu explained unhurriedly, the so-called dark cuisine in general refers to those dishes that fail to cook, have a strange color and smell, and even disgusting taste. However, this banner is actually a little misunderstanding by the owner of Full Mountain Red Restaurant. He blindly classified the food that he couldn't understand and couldn't appreciate as dark cuisine. This is a manifestation of ignorance, which is not my intention. In fact, my topic for this competition is, promote the diversification of food values and enhance the tolerance of food tasting. The food immortal was stunned. What diversification? Wang Lu said, food is ever-changing and endless. At the same time, it is also different from person to person and place to place. For example, in my hometown, Wang Family Village, there are many people who can't adapt to spicy food. My food is poison to others. Senior Food Immortal must have a deep understanding of this. And the diversification of food values that I said refers to broadening one's tolerance, being able to accept all kinds of food from all places. While they were talking, a chef from the kitchen had already brought out a pot of steaming soup. Putting aside the strange smell, the chef who was cooking the soup was actually wearing a thick mask. Furthermore, after putting down the pot of soup, he immediately turned around and ran, not staying for even a moment longer. The food immortal's eyes widened. Even the chef is avoiding this dish. What kind of delicacy is this? On the other hand, Wang Lu, without batting an eyelid, lifted the lid of the soup pot. Suddenly, 100 times stronger odor assaulted their nostrils, causing the audience outside the hall to collectively retreat a few steps. And when they saw the scene in the pot, many people's stomachs turned over. In the pot, in the dark soup, a large number of white larvae stacked on top of each other, constantly squirming and struggling, as if the soul was being tortured in purgatory. This is a food? Wang Lu nodded. This is a kind of delicacy of the indigenous tribes in the border area of the Blue River region. Although the appearance is not good, it is actually very nutritious. This kind of white larvae is carefully cultivated in a very clean environment, rich in various nutrients and more valuable than the meat we eat. And this soup is also boiled out of herbs, which has the effect of avoiding poison and heat. The locals regard this kind of insect soup as the most precious delicacy, and only when they receive the noblest guests will they serve it for people to drink. The food immortal pursed his lips and did not say a word. Wang Lu said, "Empty words are no proof, I will eat first as a sign of respect." With that, he stretched out his hand and picked up a white worm in the soup pot. The fat and tender worm struggled violently in the air, its head swung back and forth, and the black soup spilled on the table. Wang Lu shook his hand, then sent it to his mouth and bit off half of the worm's body. Like biting a plump fruit, the worm's colorful body fluid splashed out as if drawing a rainbow. Wang Lu chewed a few times, swallowed it and then grinned. Delicious. However, at the same time, many of the audience outside the venue were already pale. The complexion of the food immortal also changed slightly. For the food immortal, although insects were not a frequent guest on the menu, they were not rare. When he first cultivated in the tropical woodland, he had eaten no less than 10,000 insects, and he had mastered thousands of ways to cook insects. But among those 10,000 insects, there was never this one. Carrion insect, living on carrion. Inside its fat and tender body, the colorful body fluid was all rotten, and all of them were poisonous. Moreover, the taste was extremely cold, like a sharp knife scraping the tongue. Although the herbal soup could dissolve the poison, the taste could not be changed. Such a soup was simply difficult to swallow. This was especially true for the food immortal, who had a super keen sense of taste. The joy and pain of tasting delicious food were 100 times stronger for him than for ordinary people. Wang Lu's wooden tongue could endure the discomfort and say it was delicious, but for him to eat it, it was a heart-wrenching pain. Thinking of this, the food immortal turned his gaze to Lu Li. He had also heard a bit about this young girl who often followed Wang Lu around. In addition to her astonishing brilliant sword-heart physique, she was also famous for her food fanaticism. It was said that some time ago she once single-handedly ate a large restaurant. After witnessing it with his own eyes, the food immortal could feel that the girl had the same breath as him. She was also a glutton. Such a person was bound to be picky about food. Could she stand eating carrion insect soup? However, just when the food immortal was in doubt, he saw Wang Lu put the remaining half of the insect in his hand to Lu Li's mouth. The girl swallowed the insect completely and then burst into a dazzling smile. Delicious. The food immortal wanted to flip the table. Delicious my A*S. Tears are flowing out of the corner of your eyes. However, Lu Li still didn't give up. After eating the insect, she simply picked up the spoon and scooped up a spoonful of the black soup and drank it. Delicious. You have a tremor when you speak. Wang Lu nodded and said, that's the tremor caused by Lu Li's opening of her taste buds. This is the tremor of the explosion of the taste buds. The food immortal could no longer tolerate it. You said that the value of food should be diversified, and I agree with that. In the past, there was a dispute in the mainland food world over whether the tofu pudding should be sweet or salty, and they even fought each other, causing many cultivators to fall. That is the evil result of the simplistic value. But no matter how diversified it is, there should be a bottom line. Even the carrion insect has become a food, which is an insult to the food. I will never admit that you used this kind of unorthodox method. I'm not surprised by this. Wang Lu shrugged and said, Senior's immortal title is Food Immortal. 16,000 years ago she was a top expert in food, and her position in the food world is also very respected. She is the authority, the orthodoxy. But from another point of view, the so-called orthodoxy and authority are often obstacles to the development and growth of new things. You said that diversification should have a bottom line, but who draws the bottom line? You said that the carrion insect is an insult to the food, but in my opinion, isn't the sweet tofu pudding an insult to the tofu pudding? Whether it's an insult to the food or not, who is going to judge it? The questioning made the food immortal unable to speak. His mouth and tongue were used to taste delicacies, not to argue with people. Although he was not clumsy, he was obviously not qualified to quarrel with Wang Lu. After a long silence, the food immortal looked at Wang Lu, who seemed to have a well-thought-out plan, and Lu Li, who, under the influence of the taste of the carrion insect soup, gently stuck out her tongue. Very well, since you want to compete, then let's compete. The food immortal said, and then his eyes gradually became cold. But don't blame me for not reminding you, when it comes to tasting novelty, you are far from qualified to be compared with me. When I was looking for ingredients in the barren mountains and dead lands, I have tasted everything. With that, he stretched out his thick arm, picked up the steaming soup bowl in front of Wang Lu, and then brought it to his mouth. He raised his hand, raised his head, and cleaned up the soup in one gulp. Ha, it's indeed a good taste. The food immortal's expression was cold, and his voice was as cold as the ice of the 9 underworlds. However, at the same time, a wisp of smoke rose from his throat. Chapter 657. This was an unprecedentedly tragic battle. The audience standing outside the full mountain red building all sighed with emotion. Since the opening of the grand competition, it was not that they had never seen a bloodbath. However, in terms of tragic and shocking, none of them could be compared with this dark cuisine competition. Of the 100,000 spectators, less than half of them were left in the 2 hours of the competition. It was not that Wang Lu's popularity was not enough, nor was it that the importance of the competition had declined. It was just that the scene was so tragic that people could not bear to look straight at it. Even the reporter of the newspaper of Mysterious Sky Mansion, who insisted on being in the front line, the young and handsome reporter who was used to the wind and rain, felt that he could not hold on any longer. He wrote in his notes, "In my opinion, this competition is like 2 people competing to kill each other." Then 2 rounds of death by 1,000 cuts were carried out at the same time. I watched them fall into the abyss step by step, but I never got tired of it. Before this, I never thought that a food competition could be so tragic. No wonder people often say never underestimate the surprise that Wang Lu brings to you. In fact, as a cultural event, the atmosphere of this dark cuisine competition was quite harmonious. From the beginning of the competition, the 2 sides each occupied a round table and ate. They did not interfere with each other and even ignored each other. Wang Lu also stood in the middle of the 2 tables and only occasionally opened his mouth when necessary to explain the origin and eating method of the dishes to the contestants and the audience. However, it was really difficult for people who had witnessed the glory of those dishes to associate them with the food in their mouths. The pot of dark white worm soup was just an appetizer. The real meal was yet to come. There were meat pies made from rotting flesh and blood, hot dishes cooked with rotting organs, as well as coleslaw that looked suspiciously like both meat and grass. Every single dish exuded an aura that was even more toxic. After seeing it with one's own eyes, one would instinctively feel repulsed and even fearful. According to the results of the reporter's interview, many people would rather choose to take poison than try the taste of those dishes. Even if I take poison, as long as I determine what poison it is, I can at least get rid of it. But those dishes, I don't know what will happen if I eat them. However, it was such a terrible dish that the two contestants swept one plate after another at an amazing speed. I guess they had to hurry. The reporter recorded on a piece of paper with a serious expression. That kind of thing, staying in the mouth for a moment longer, is a great torture. Both contestants showed painful expressions from time to time during the eating process, but I think that compared to the real pain they suffered, the surface pain was only 1 in 10 million. In fact, I really want to try those dark cuisines right now, but considering that there are no substitute reporters behind me once I fall, it will be difficult to record this exciting match, so I can only suppress my curiosity and try it after the match is over. Please wish me luck. On the other side, the situation on the field was undergoing subtle changes. It's not over yet? The fat food immortal endured the annoyance in his heart and stuffed a piece of unknown meat into his mouth. A strong stimulating taste bloomed on the tip of his tongue. It was as if a skunk that had become a spirit had curled up in his mouth and let out a fierce fart. The taste was like a tidal wave that impacted his mind. The pain he felt was like someone was cutting his fat flesh with a sharp sword. Not only did it hurt his body, but it also hurt his heart. This dark cuisine competition was too vicious. It was completely aimed at him, the food immortal, and the design was extremely tricky. It was not difficult for the food immortal to digest and endure the food that entered his mouth. Even a foundation establishment cultivator could eat a plate of poison without batting an eyelid, and then digest it with his body and magical power, unless the poison was no longer a mortal poison. As for the food immortal, there were not many poisons in the world that could make him unable to digest them. However, this was an eating competition. What was placed on the table in front of him was food, not poison, at least nominally. Therefore, it was necessary for both sides to treat each dish the same way they treated food. Simply put, the way of swallowing was not feasible. It was necessary to taste the taste of each dish and carefully chew it before swallowing it. Of course, the self-deceiving method of shielding the taste was prohibited. As a cultivator at the top of the food path, the sensitivity of the food immortal's taste was also unparalleled in the world. For the same dark cuisine, if the damage to Luli was 10, then the damage to him was 100 or even 1000. In a sense, Wang Lu's concept of food diversification was really not wrong. It was also not wrong to open the taste buds and welcome the diversity of food. However, the bottom line that the food immortal insisted on was not wrong. Not everything could be called a gourmet. For example, a stone, a pile of feces, if it was really digested, it could be digested by many cultivators. The food immortal himself could. Strictly speaking, these substances that could be digested by cultivators could, of course, be regarded as food. However, they could not be regarded as food. Since food had the word beauty, it should be loved and yearned for by people. However, normal people would not yearn for stones and feces. Humans' tendency toward food was the accumulated experience of millions of years. For example, people liked sweets and meat because sweets and meat were rich in nutrients that human beings needed. But what nutrition could there be in stones and feces? However, there were no absolutes in the world. 9 regions was big and full of strange things, and not everyone could grow up in a normal environment. For example, those natives who had lived in the barren mountains and rivers for hundreds of thousands of years had long adapted to the local environment. Sweets and meat were rare luxuries for them. They relied more on substances that ordinary people could not digest as food, and gradually developed a good impression and even dependence on those food. With ingredients there would be food and there would be food culture. These ingredients that seemed unreasonable to ordinary people, through the careful processing of the local people, would also become artistic treasures. It was just that, these things were delicious to the local people but dark cuisine to others. For example, the porridge in front of the food immortal was not cooked with rice or other grains. It was made with a large number of pebbles, each of which was fine and smooth. The grains were only the size of soybeans. Moreover, when the bowl was full, the difference in volume would not exceed 1/10. The water was turbid lime water, thick and vigorous. In the eyes of the rock tribe, this was a good food. They lived in the mountains and had nothing but rocks and soil. After tens of thousands of years, they had evolved the ability to eat stones. The stones were divided into high and low grades according to the degree of delicacy. This bowl of lime pebble porridge was a treasure that only the patriarch of the rock tribe was qualified to enjoy. However, in front of the food immortal, it was really difficult to swallow. Especially after eating a piece of stinky meat just now, what the food immortal needed was a really silky smooth drink, not a lime pebble porridge that burned the throat and blocked the esophagus. What's wrong? Senior food immortal can't eat anymore? Or is the food not to your taste? Although the ingredients may be a bit unique, I think for a gourmet master, just tasting the dishes, the enthusiasm of the chef is very precious. The food immortal sneered and said, "I don't need a reckless kid like you to teach me what a delicious food is." A real gourmet, especially in the realm of food immortal, tasted not only the taste of the food but also the feelings of the chef. Lime pebble porridge was not a delicacy in the orthodox sense, but the serious mood of the rock tribe chef when cooking the porridge was not fake. The only problem was that, after all, it was not a delicacy in the orthodox sense. Thinking of this, the food immortal inwardly sighed with slight regret. Wang Lu was right, he was the orthodox authority in the gourmet world, and his taste buds had long been orthodox. He could not taste the evil and crooked delicacy 18,000 years ago. This was the choice that he had to make when he cultivated the way of food, abandoning the evil and crooked path in exchange for the advancement of the right path. In this regard, he, the dignified food immortal, was indeed not as good as a simple girl like Lu Li. He was like a picture scroll with a lofty artistic conception. Every stroke contained endless mystery, while Lu Li was still like a piece of white paper. The value of the white paper was naturally far less than the picture scroll, but in terms of plasticity the white paper was far ahead. Lime pebble porridge, the food immortal could not go against his heart and say it was delicious. The taste buds of a gourmet protested all the time. Were it not for his powerful cultivation base to suppress it, perhaps his tongue would have already self-destructed to show his will. And suppressing this tongue that belonged to Dixian became more and more strenuous. However, after the initial difficult period, Lu Li gradually adapted to the rhythm of these dark cuisines and began to eat in an orderly manner. She did not feel bitter at all, and even gradually realized the way to taste the artistic conception of the meal. With this, the situation became more and more unfavorable. At present, in terms of battle record, the food immortal was still far ahead. According to the calculation of 1 point per dish, he had accumulated more than 300 points, while Lu Li only had around 200 points. However, Lu Li's speed was getting faster and faster. The girl was able to put rocks, metals, poisonous water, sawdust, and so on into her mouth without hesitation. However, the food immortal used more and more energy to suppress his tongue, which inevitably slowed down. However, the food immortal was not worried that he would lose. Because this competition was not unlimited. Just like the previous competition, the first to reach 500 points would win. As long as he persisted, he would be able to get 500 points faster than his opponent. Lu Li's speed was very fast, but compared to the food immortal, it was only a negligible bit faster. If he wanted to blame someone, it was Wang Lu's misestimation of his endurance. It was true that every time he ate, it was like burning his body, but his body was fat and oily, which could not be burned off in a short period of time. At this time, the dishes that were served from the kitchen suddenly stopped. There were still dishes on the food immortal's table, but seeing this, he could not help but frown. Wang Lu would not openly use this kind of rogue skill, right? He cut off his own dishes so that he could not get any points. If Wang Lu was really so naive, then it would be exactly what he wanted. Because as the food immortal, how could he not have enough food? At that time, since Wang Lu's dishes could not be served, he would eat his own dishes. It would only be more comfortable to eat. However, just as the food immortal was puzzled, a closed door in the distance opened. From the door, a blonde girl slowly came out. She was not tall, wearing a snow-white chef's uniform and a tall chef's hat, and holding a shiny silver plate in her hand. Night King? The food immortal was surprised. Unexpectedly, his opponent from not long ago appeared in front of him as a chef today. What was even more unexpected was the dishes that the other party served on the table. Aya expressionlessly walked to the food immortal's table, put down the plate in her hand and then stiffly said, "This is the traditional food of my hometown, look up at the starry sky, please have a taste." Looking at the more than 10 dead dried fish in front of him, the food immortal was speechless for a long time. After a long time, the food immortal carefully picked up a piece of fish with chopsticks and put it into his mouth. The next moment, his complexion changed. Bah! The piece of fish fell on the table with a mouthful of bloody spit. The food immortal's thin eyebrows twisted. His broad palms slapped the table and his body stood up straight. Is this also for people to eat? The host, Wang Lu, seemed to have been waiting for a long time. He strode over and pointed to the blood-bathed fish on the table. Waste of food, deduct 1 point. Chapter 658. In this dark cuisine competition, the food immortal had eaten carrion insects, eaten rotten meat pies and drank stone porridge. Wang Lu mobilized the power of the Union of 10,000 Immortals and collected all kinds of exotic delicacies from all corners of 9 regions. He had basically seen all of them and could be considered as a veteran. This experience was rich and bizarre. In the thousands of years of memory of the food immortal, excluding the 16,000 years of deep sleep period, it was unprecedented. Sometimes, after tasting the dark cuisine, the food immortal would think that if he wanted to find a successor in the future, he must tell this experience to the successor and teach them not to be picky about food. At that time he could say that, in the dark cuisine competition of the grand competition, I don't know how much more strange it was than what you guys eat now. I was talking and laughing with the host. Just thinking about it made people feel impassioned. However, after tasting a Western delicacy, this lofty sentiments had completely disappeared. Is this also for people to eat? The food immortal stood up angrily and wished he could throw the plate on the ground on the spot, if it weren't for the fact that the chef who made the dish was standing in front of him and obviously had a stronger fighting capacity than him. He had explored the way of food for thousands of years, but this was the first time he had eaten such a strong and stimulating food. Hearing the protest of the food immortal, Aya lightly asked, "Excuse me, do you have any dissatisfaction with my dish? It's not a question of satisfaction, but, are you a chef or a poison master? This kind of awe-inspiring thing is enough to be used as a bomb, yet you dare to bring it to the table?" Aya was silent for a moment and then said, "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb." The food immortal angrily slapped the table, and then reached out to dig a piece of the fish head cake. He pinched it between his fingers, and then his immortal spirit energy burst out and penetrated into the cake. The next moment there was a muffled bang. A small explosion broke out between the 2 fingers of the food immortal. The fish head cake exploded into thousands of powder crumbs, each of which was as dazzling as the stars in the night sky. Most of them were collected by the food immortal's immortal spirit energy, and a few fell on the table. With a popping sound, the thick table was shot with countless small holes. See for yourself. Whose food could be so lethal? Aya tilted her head in confusion. The bowl of concentrated sour soup you drank not long ago could turn hundreds of people into pus. Its lethality is not low. That's the problem with the ingredients themselves, but the sword intent in your dish was clearly poured in on purpose. Furthermore, the highly concentrated sour soup can be dissolved with cultivation. Your sword intent almost blew my head off. My tongue was almost cut off by you. Aya nodded. Yes, but this is the cooking tradition of my hometown. Don't you like it? Which family would have such a tradition? Eating a meal was like fighting a war. What kind of mentality do you have when cooking? Aya continued, the House of Knights, whose mission is to fight, is like this. As for when I cook, usually, it's to recall the situation of the battlefield. Only by letting the soldiers not forget about the battle even when they're eating can they maintain their vigilance at all times and maintain a state of battle. The food immortal was dumbfounded. Such a shameless lie sounded flawless. What was going on? Of course, he didn't know that Aya was telling the truth. In the past, when she was fighting in Bretonia, she did cook for her beloved generals and soldiers to boost their morale. Later, she was deserted and the country fell apart. It had to be said that the foreshadowing was laid from that moment on. Wang Lu faintly said, "In short, Senior Food Immortal, please don't waste time. This is a rare delicacy. If it gets cold, it won't taste good. You're ruthless. Let's eat." The food immortal also hardened his heart, filled his mouth with immortal spirit energy, and then directly grabbed the plate, swallowed, then looked up at the starry sky, and then chewed and swallowed. It was just that every time he chewed, it was accompanied by thousands of sounds of sword energy. And every time he swallowed, the food immortal felt as if his throat was being cut by thousands of sharp swords, which was extremely painful. After eating the dish, the food immortal immediately took out a cup of tea from his mustard seed bag. It was the 10,000-year-old flower tea that he had kept for a long time, which could nourish the body of an immortal. It was just that after half a cup of tea entered his mouth, he saw a shocking bloody lip mark on the edge of the cup. That look up at the starry sky actually caused his internal organs to be injured. After the tea soaked his throat and repaired all the thousands of small wounds, the food immortal sighed, thinking that he hadn't eaten such a hard dish for more than 10,000 years. Okay, next one. A moment later, Aya came over with a plate of fish head cake. When the food immortal saw the dozen or so dried fish, he felt a chill all over his body. He immediately got up and protested, "Wait, why is it still this dish? Didn't you say that the dishes will not be repeated? Aya coldly said, What? It's fine if you're not good at math but you can't even count? Count? The food immortal was stunned when he heard this. When he took a closer look, he couldn't help but cry out in his heart. It turned out that the fish head cake was still the same kind of fish head cake, but there was one more fish head inserted on it. Can this be regarded as a refurbished dish? Quantitative change leads to qualitative change. Wang Lu chimed in at the right time to explain, for example, if you go to bed with a woman, it's called adultery, but if you go to bed with more than one woman, it's called gathering for sexual intercourse. That crime is very different. What kind of bullshit explanation is that? The food immortal shook his head. Forget it, fish head cake is fish head cake, but you at least have to ensure that there's no difference in the dishes on the two tables. Wang Lu nodded. That's natural. If there's something on senior's table, then there's naturally something on the other table. The food immortal frowned. He always felt that things were still a little wrong. Logically speaking, it was difficult for even him to deal with the fish head cake made with sword intent from a supreme. For Jindan stage cultivators, it was undoubtedly a deadly poison that could seal the Marquis's blood. Perhaps even a cultivator of non-phase method like Wang Lu would explode and die after eating the cake just now. Luli was strong in offense but weak in defense, so eating it would only cause indigestion. Could it be that she had a secret recipe for digestion? At this time, there were still nearly 200 dishes to eat before he had accumulated 500 points to win. The food immortal asked himself, if every dish had the level of look up at the starry sky, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to persist until the last moment. Aya's strength was indeed above him, and he really couldn't afford to eat such a sincere swordsman's food infused with sword intent. Thus, the only chance of winning was that the opponent could also persist for less than 500 points, and he only needed to persist more than her to win. The problem was, from the beginning of the competition to the present, every step was in the calculation of Wang Lu, so would he leave such an opportunity for him? Would Lu Li really not be able to cope with look up at the starry sky? However, how could he cope with it? For a cultivator of the King Pill sect to eat a supreme-level dish was a suicidal act unless... While thinking, the food immortal insisted on eating look up at the starry sky more than 20 times. In the end, he coughed incessantly because his internal organs were injured by the sword intent. Fortunately, he had a lot of medicinal pills with him so he could barely support it. And Lu Li also took this opportunity to catch up with his points, reaching 300 points, and then began to fight the Western continent cuisine. Although it was the same look up at the starry sky, Aya didn't show any mercy. Moreover, compared to the food immortal's portion, the portion that was given to Lu Li seemed to be a bit bigger. The food immortal stared at his opponent and released all his 5 senses. Even at a distance of several meters, he could vaguely sense that the sword intent buried in the opponent's plate was more biting cold than his own. Aya really didn't show any mercy, so how could Lu Li digest such a dark cuisine? The next moment, in the astonished eyes of the food immortal, Lu Li giggled and, accompanied by an innocent smile, fiercely dug a spoonful of roasted soft fish head cake and sent it into her mouth. The next moment, the sword intent broke out, and the girl's colorful dress swelled up like a balloon. Thousands of sword chi surged out from it, as if to tear the dress into pieces and expose the spring scenery. However, the sword chi that left her body was like an arrow that had lost its arrowhead. It had the power but lost its sharpness. The sword chi swelled up the dress, but like an arrow at the end of its flight, it couldn't cut or tear it. A moment later, Lu Li gradually controlled the sword chi and gathered it inside her body, no longer leaking out. When she opened her eyes, Lu Li's eyes were clear and transparent. Her body was as sharp as a sword, and her aura had a bit of the Night King's sword charm. The food immortal was dumbfounded. Did she just eat it? A mouthful of fish cake that contained the supreme-level sword intent was digested just like that? By a little Taoist Master King Pill? How could there be such a reason in this world? Lu Li was not a perverted King Pill like Wang Wu. What she cultivated was not an outside path, but the brilliant sword heart that had been passed down since ancient times. And brilliant sword heart. Thinking of this, the food immortal was stunned. Brilliant sword heart? It was difficult to verify the origin of this cultivation method. Even in the most glorious era of the immortal path, it was still the top level. However, on the other hand, cultivators who could cultivate brilliant sword heart had always been rare, even in hundreds or thousands of years. This was because the requirements for a cultivator were too harsh. To be able to cultivate this technique, one had to have a clear, translucent and untainted sword body, as well as a similarly clear and ethereal heart. It didn't sound difficult, but to truly meet the requirements, it was truly difficult to find one in hundreds or even thousands of years. Therefore, people had long heard of the name of Brilliant Sword Heart, but they didn't know the details. They didn't know how many magical abilities a cultivator who had achieved small success in Brilliant Sword Heart would have. The biggest feature of Lu Li was her strong explosive power, and her attack power was unparalleled among cultivators of the same stage. In addition, although she also had a variety of magical abilities such as strong endurance, poison immunity, and so on, there were many similar magical abilities, not unique to Brilliant Sword Heart. Therefore, few people really paid attention to it. However, now it seemed that the biggest advantage of Brilliant Sword Heart was not the strong explosive power, but the tolerance of the sword had reached an unimaginable level. The tyrannical sword intent of the Night King could actually be eaten by her in the King Pill stage. After a long silence, the food immortal finally sighed. It's indeed a good appetite. The younger generation will surpass the older in time, the old saying is not wrong. Aya's look up at the starry sky in the traditional sense did not have any good taste. It was a dark cuisine through and through. However, as a peerless swordsman, the sword intent that Aya poured into it was an extraordinary rare material. As long as it could be digested, one could feel the many experiences of a supreme-level swordsman. It was just that, in the whole world there were very few people who could digest this gourmet feast. Let's end this match here. I admit defeat. Please pay attention to the WeChat public platform, add friends, public account, and search for His Majesty the King. Thank you everyone. Chapter 659. We won. Aha, we won this game again. Long live. Along with the desolate defeat of the food immortal, the cheers outside the Full Mountain Red restaurant surged like waves. Although because of the unique atmosphere of the dark cuisine, the scene outside the restaurant was no longer as grand as it was at the beginning, and the number of onlookers was reduced by a small half, tens of thousands of people cheered in unison. The momentum was still impressive, and the festive atmosphere overflowed like a substance. Although it was only a small game with less than 10 points, and although the victory relied more on intrigue than on strength, the result of the victory was more important than anything else. People didn't need to bother to think so much. At this moment they just needed to enjoy the victory. After the food immortal left silently, the audience couldn't hold back their enthusiasm and poured into the restaurant hall. The hundreds of people at the front filled the restaurant hall in an instant, and more people were crowding at the back. If it weren't for the pure gold strongman who arrived in time to maintain order, these enthusiastic audience could overturn the restaurant. The first hundreds of audience who entered the restaurant surrounded Wang Lu, Lu Li, and Aya, and constantly sent their blessings and praises. Most of these blessings were given to Wang Lu. Long live Wang Lu. Wang Lu, we love you the most. Wang Lu, I want to give you a baby. Although the person who personally won the game was Lu Li, and the person who made the key move was Aya, everyone knew that the real protagonist of the game was Wang Lu. Without his careful design and layout, there was no way to talk about this victory. No one could compete with the food immortal in the way of food. Before Wang Lu made his move, the food immortal had defeated many famous food masters in 9 regions in the Wuxia League. Each time it was an overwhelming advantage and there was no hope. However, with just a few simple layouts by Wang Lu, the invincible Dixian at the table, lost 2 games in a row. The significance of this was far more than the 20 points brought by the 2 games. Because people began to think that perhaps under the leadership of Wang Lu, the Wuxia League could really reverse the situation and win the final victory. That was what really mattered. Wang Lu, will we still win? A young cultivator next to Wang Lu asked excitedly. Of course. Wang Lu replied affirmatively, of course we will win. So, will you continue to make your move? Wang Lu nodded and said, yes, these 2 victories are just the beginning. The more exciting content is yet to come. But when will you come in person? We want to see you personally defeat those Dixian League. We want to see you defeat those Dixian League. You have to know that a good climax must be built on enough foreplay. After an unknown amount of time, Wang Lu finally dealt with wave after wave of fanatical fans. If he wanted to meet them one there he Diqing he hu di he Liang Lu League. If he wanted to meet them one by one, he wouldn't be able to do anything else for the next month. Therefore, seeing that his amiable image had almost been operated, Wang Lu declined the next meeting. After calling the golden red strongman to close the door of the restaurant and ensure that it was quiet, Wang Lu took a long breath and lay down on his back. Lu Li curiously asked, Senior brother, what's wrong with you? However, the answer to her was silence. Wang Lu had closed his eyes and fallen asleep. The girl was a bit worried and wanted to push him. Aya, who was behind him, came over, shook her head and said softly, "Don't disturb him, let him rest for a while. In the past few days he should be the most tired one among us." Luli didn't ask much. Since Sister Aya said so, she would just obey. It was just that, "Sister Aya, I'm hungry." I was a bit surprised. She ate so much just now and now she was still hungry? However, she soon realized that although Luli had put a lot of food into her mouth, it was likely that all of it was eliminated by her as waste. There was actually no oil left in her stomach. No wonder she was hungry at this time. Not only she didn't replenish her nutrition, she had to consume a lot of true yuan to eliminate the waste, so it would be strange if she wasn't hungry. It was just that. Aya looked back and somewhat hesitantly said, "But the chefs have already gone back, this place is closed." Luli giggled. "Sister Aya, aren't you also a chef?" Meh. Aya was even more surprised. "Are you willing to eat my dishes?" "Yes." But Aya was still hesitant. If Wang Lu made the request, she would be very happy to cook hundreds of traditional Bretonia dishes and then force Wang Lu to eat them all, including the plate. However, Luli was naive and extremely likable, so people really couldn't bear to trick her. While Aya was hesitating, Luli suddenly stood up and then jumped over to hold Aya's hand, firmly imprisoning the girl's slender but powerful arm in the deep ravine. "Sister Aya, I'm really hungry." Being so coquettishly begged by Luli, Aya felt that as the Night King, the sharp sword in her heart instantly melted like her arm that was deeply immersed in the soft jade. Okay, I know I'll do it for you. But don't disturb his rest here, come with me to the kitchen." Okay. Then Aya smiled, tied the apron again, took Luli's hand and led her into the kitchen. A moment later, Aya carried a plate of golden color and rich aroma of golden egg fried rice to the small kitchen table. Luli couldn't wait any longer. She picked up the spoon and unceremoniously scooped a spoonful of it into her mouth. The next moment, tears of joy flowed down her cheeks. "Good, delicious. This is the first time I've eaten such delicious egg-fried rice." Aya sat on the side, looking at Lu Li's entangled expression with a smile. On one hand, the girl wanted to follow the call of instinct, boldly and unrestrainedly eat, but on the other hand she didn't dare to forget her master's exhortation, so she had to pretend to be a gentle and quiet lady. Thus when eating she was bashful and carefree. "If you want to eat, then eat. There's no one else here." Okay. Lu Li gratefully looked at her and then directly picked up the plate. Aya couldn't help but laugh in spite of herself. This child really had no shrewdness, innocent and tender. Seeing her always made people feel warm inside, even those rigid dogma could be thrown to the back of their mind. According to the Knight's Creed, deception was intolerable. However, for Lu Li she was willing to slightly ignore those rigid rules. "Sister Aya." Lu Li finished the last mouthful of rice, contentedly licked the rice on the corner of her mouth, and then asked, "Why didn't you show it before when you're so good at cooking?" Upon hearing this question, Aya was somewhat annoyed and somewhat helpless. "You guys should give me a chance to show off." The young girl Lu Li tilted her head in puzzlement. "When you guys go to my Misty Peak cafeteria, when did you not bring your own dry food? In this grand competition you lied to me saying that I should carry forward the excellent traditional food culture. As a result, it turned out that the Poison Group wanted to innovate. When the competition began you asked me to be a guest chef, but I was asked to cook the dark cuisine, look up at the starry sky. Tell me, how should I show my craftsmanship?" Although Lu Li was naive listening to Aya's confession, she also faintly felt the grief and indignation in the heart of the Night King. Thus, she could not help but reach out her hand to touch Aya's wrist. "Sister Aya, it's so hard." Aya shook her head. "Bretonia people are not good at cooking, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. And among the people of Bretonia, my culinary skill is also very poor. I really don't know how to cook and I have always disagreed with cooking." Lu Li curiously asked, "Why?" "I used to be a king, and I need to maintain my dignity in front of hundreds of millions of people all the time. And personally cooking is undoubtedly too frivolous. I had once cooked for the soldiers under my command on the battlefield, hoping to make them realize that they were comrades and that they should have brotherly feelings for each other. However, it caused a huge drop in morale. The soldiers and even some of my trusted subordinates were very disappointed when they saw me. Obviously for them the king cooking is an intolerable evil." Lu Li seemed to understand but not really understand. She only felt that it was difficult to be a king. Aya also said, "Since then I have a psychological rejection of cooking. Later, when I came to 9 regions and settled down on Spirit Sword Mountain, I was already disheartened and put down the identity of the king. Therefore I chose to be a chef. It's just that, when I finally realized the correct cooking method, it seems that I have already made a big mistake. Speaking to this, Aya could not help but sigh. Thinking of those ashen-faced disciples of Spirit Sword sect who fled from the Misty Peak cafeteria, her heart was really uncomfortable. Cooking is really a broad and profound art. In the past few years, I devoted all my energy to it, devoutly studying cooking as I once did to the way of the sword. I regarded the chopping board as the battlefield, and it was not until recently that I had a small success and realized the right way. Sister Aya is really amazing. Lu Li sincerely praised. In this case, in the future when I go to the Misty Peak cafeteria with senior brother Wang Lu, I can eat the real good things. Wang Lu? Upon hearing this name, Aya raised her eyebrows. Don't tell him about this. What? Humph, since that scoundrel's impression of my cooking is so deep-rooted, then let him continue to be obsessed with it. Aya said and then looked at the direction of the restaurant outside the door. Wang Lu was still lying on the ground, asleep. Lu Li, in the future if you want to eat anything just come to my cafeteria alone. If you're with Wang Lu you can only look up at the starry sky. Lu Li immediately became vigilant. I know. First of all, please follow me on WeChat to add friends. Just search for His Majesty the King in the public account. Then I recommend Tencent Animation's Spirit Sword Mountain comic. The two cute girls cartoonists are very good. Friends who like comic must go and see it. Tencent Animation's Spirit Sword Mountain comic is enough. Chapter 660. The third match is scheduled for tomorrow morning. As for the event, I think this unparalleled divine calculation is very good. Immortal 5 Area, Chief Planning House. Wang Lu pondered for a long time at his desk and finally chose the time for his third appearance. Next to Wang Lu, Hai Yunfan, who was still acting as a secretary, was somewhat puzzled. Tomorrow morning's unparalleled divine calculation? That's a calculation competition regardless of realm. The contestant on our side is the head of my sect, Supreme Tian Luan, and the opponent is the Swanxian Lu Biechen who can release all his power. Do you want to participate in this kind of competition that surpasses the supreme level? Wang Lu said, how could my previous 2 matches be divided into different realms? The 2 food competitions are all realms. Hai Yunfan shook his head. How can the nature of these matches be compared? The unparalleled divine calculation is a fighting event in the literary competition, which is completely different from your purely literary food competition. The food immortal is one of the weakest people in Dixian. He is weak and lacks the quick-wittedness to adapt to changes, so he will be calculated by you. But Swanxian Lu Biechen is so talented that he won't be so easily fooled by you. Be careful not to play with fire and burn yourself. Wang Lu smiled, you think too much. For a Dixian like Lu Biechen who is good at calculation and calculation, unless you have the ability to deceive heaven's secrets, don't plot against him. Because every step of your calculation will fall into a bigger calculation and hurt yourself. I'm still a few realms away from deceiving heaven's secrets, so I won't court death. Then what are you going to do? If you don't plot and don't participate, are you going to watch the whole time? Wang Lu nodded, yes, I can't plot and I can't participate. Of course, I can only watch the whole time. Oh, I'll cheer for Supreme Tian Luan when needed. What kind of method is this? If you come to watch, won't the outcome fall on our head? Wang Lu smiled and asked, it's his competition to begin with. A dignified supreme, but the victory or defeat has to fall on me, a Taoist Master King Pill. Not to mention whether I'm willing or not, Supreme Tian Luan himself will never agree. Hearing this, Hai Yunfan also understood Wang Lu's intention. So you want to borrow strength? You already knew that our sect leader would win, so you wanted to use his victory to show off your prestige. Wang Lu said, that's right. I'm optimistic that Skywheel will win this match, so I simply push the boat with the current and borrow the east wind to boost my momentum. And I believe that with Supreme Tian Luan's mind, he wouldn't mind me taking advantage of him. But are you sure you can defeat Lu Biechen? The opponent is Dixian who is good at calculating. Upon hearing this, Wang Lu smiled again and said, Little Hai, you're an elite disciple of 10,000 Arts sect, how could you not understand such a simple and basic truth? No matter how good Lu Biechen is at calculating, he's still an antique from 16,000 years ago. His algorithm has long been behind the times. Even if his stage is a bit higher than that of a supreme, and his computing power is stronger, how could his efficiency be compared with that of modern people? Not to mention other things, Supreme Tian Luan's calculation of the world's human feelings, as long as it is perfected in the future, it would be enough to save hundreds of millions of people who have no EQ. How can a mere calculation immortal who is past his prime be compared to him? Hai Yunfan pondered for a moment and said, hearing you say that, I actually think it makes sense. Wang Lu said, of course it makes sense, so I can be sure that I will win this match. Otherwise I wouldn't have come forward. What I need now is a series of victories to accumulate morale. The winning streak must not be broken, otherwise all the previous efforts will be wasted. Upon hearing this, Hai Yunfan could not help but ask, I've always wanted to ask, why are you so obsessed with the winning streak now? Of course it's for a greater victory. Wang Lu shook his head and didn't explain much. He just turned his attention back to the pile of documents on the table, looking for what he wanted. On the morning of the second day, outside the fighting arena in the central area of Immortal 2 area, there was a hubbub of voices and the atmosphere was hot. Compared with the arena in Immortal 1 area, which was built with hundreds of millions of essences and had mysterious magical abilities like an independent small world, the arena in Immortal 2 area was much smaller. However, it also had all kinds of incredible magical abilities, which could accommodate a supreme-level powerhouse to fight in it. It was just that, in the several months since the start of the grand competition, this arena had never welcomed a supreme-level contestant. Supreme was the strongest fighting force in the Wanxian League. Each of them had an extraordinary significance and would never easily come to the stage. Therefore, since Supreme Hichu won the first match, there had been no more Supreme matches, except for a certain Night King who had the power of a Supreme. Supreme Tianluan was the first person to break this deadlock in months. Patter. A slight sound of footsteps landing on the ground stirred up the dark arena. In an instant, the darkness receded and the light swept across. Supreme Tianluan's white clothes and elegant and refined figure appeared in the center of the arena. Above his head was a boundless blue sky. Under his feet, there was a boundless sea of clouds. A huge and extremely complex engraved roulette appeared behind him. Half of it was submerged in the sea of clouds and the bottom could not be seen, while the other half went straight to the sky and the top could not be seen. This was the immortal treasure of Supreme Tianluan, which was unique in the world. Seeing this roulette was equivalent to seeing Supreme Tianluan. When the Tianluan appeared, the sea of clouds in the arena gradually rolled and surged. The indomitable roulette slowly rotated, and countless colors flowed out of the engraved gaps of the roulette and dyed the white clouds with color. When the white clouds were dyed brown, they became thick soil. When the white clouds were dyed light blue, there were trickling streams and then there were trees, birds and beasts. Not long after, a land full of spring condensed under the feet of Supreme Tianluan. At the same time, there was complete silence outside the arena. Hundreds of thousands of people stared at all this, and the shock in their hearts was indescribable. The arena in the Immortal 2 area had been reset in advance. At first it was chaotic. However, after Supreme Tianluan appeared, he used his own cultivation base to divide the world into yin and yang, the 4 symbols and the 5 elements. In the end he created a vibrant small world. This was like the creation of the world. It was the declaration of the appearance of Supreme Tianluan, announcing that the fight between Supreme Tianluan and Dixian was about to begin. Outside the arena, the audience burst into a burst of heart-wrenching cheers. Witnessing this scene, any cultivator would be moved from the bottom of their heart, not to mention that Supreme Tianluan already had the prestige to make people fascinated with him. As the leader of 10,000 Arts sect and one of the most powerful cultivators in the world, Supreme Tianluan enjoyed a high prestige in 9 regions. This was far from comparable to the rising stars such as Wang Lu and Qianghua. Wang Lu's prestige was more limited to the cultivators below the King Pill. Although there were many admirers, they could not lead the mainstream of public opinion. The ones who really led the trend and occupied the high-end position were those supreme with the great magical ability to move mountains and fill the sea. They were usually aloof and had a low reputation among the lower class. Even when many people were asked who the leader of 10,000 Arts sect was, some people would be tongue-tied and unable to say it. It seemed that their popularity and prestige were much inferior to that of the hot stars such as Wang Lu and Qianghua. However, once these supreme made any move, its influence would quickly radiate to every corner of 9 regions. In this regard, no younger generation star could be compared with them. A moment later, the cheers outside the arena gradually subsided. It was not that people were tired of shouting, nor was it that Supreme Tianluan couldn't stand the disturbance and reached out to stop them. Because in the small world created by Supreme Tianluan, there was an uninvited guest. He was dressed in black, had black hair, was tall and thin, and his temperament was like a strange peak, which was in sharp contrast to the handsome Supreme Tianluan. He took a step forward and stepped into the arena from outside the void. When his foot landed, he landed 3 feet in front of Supreme Tianluan. As soon as this step fell, the mountains and rivers behind him suddenly shattered, and half of the world was broken by his step. However, it was immediately reborn. Mountain peaks rose from the ground in the embrace of the sea of clouds. Between the drifting clouds and mist, one could hear the sound of nature, which made people's heart beat faster and their souls captivated. Compared with the business world of Supreme Tianluan, the world of this man in black seemed aloof and unreachable. The immortal aura was so strong that people could not help but feel ashamed of their inferiority. Xuanxian Lu Biechen. For most of the audience outside the arena, this was the first time they saw this Dixian who was famous for his calculation. At first, people thought that he would be similar to the food immortal. Although he had the name Dixian, he didn't have any powerful magical ability. However, the moment they saw him, especially after seeing his magical ability to break mountains and rivers with one foot and create a world with one thought, they let go of all the flukes. Although this person didn't often appear in public like Bai Zhe and Xianemo, the power of his magical ability could only be strong. He was the most powerful opponent that the Wanxian League had encountered so far. Therefore, people naturally worried about Supreme Tianluan. They are worried about you. On the arena, the black-haired Swan Xian suddenly smiled. Their worries are very reasonable because your chance of winning this battle is no more than 20%. With that, he took a step forward, and suddenly the whole world behind him moved forward, eroding and swallowing the ground under Supreme Tianluan's feet, turning it into lingering clouds and strange peaks in the fog. The momentum of the erosion did not stop. After Lu Biechen stopped, it still moved forward with inertia, engulfing more space. Supreme Tianluan frowned slightly, and the Tianluan behind him slowly rotated, so thousands of colorful streams penetrated from the gap of the wheel, stabilizing his side of the world and began to push back toward the opponent. Boom! Hundreds of thousands of people outside the arena felt their hearts beat heavily at this time, as if they were resonated by some powerful force. There was a deafening sound in their ears. However, all of this was just an illusion. There was actually no sound in the arena, and even if there was, it would not reach outside the arena. The confrontation just now was just the result of the collision of two unimaginable great magical abilities. If I remember correctly, this match should be about unparalleled divine calculation, right? Why do those two people seem to be fighting with their lives? In the audience outside the arena, a young cultivator asked his master in confusion. His master sighed and said, "What they are competing in is calculation. Now, they are calculating all things in the world and the creation of life. Whoever calculates more can occupy more space and squeeze the other's world. It's not brute force. This kind of method has already reached the divine level, it's not something you and I can figure out." The disciple nodded as if he understood, but looking at the situation in the arena, he couldn't help but worry. But Supreme Tianluan doesn't seem to be his opponent. As he spoke, Tianluan had taken 2 steps back. Although it was only 2 steps, each step crossed thousands of mountains and rivers, making the world of Xuanxian and Lu Biechen expand rapidly. The difference between Supreme and Dixian seemed to be obvious at a glance. However, at this time, in this world of fierce confrontation, there was a clatter, the sound of feet landing on the ground. At this time, a young man in a red and white robe made a grand appearance. Chapter 661. The appearance of Wang Lu attracted the attention of the two sides at the same time. Supreme Tianluan turned his head slightly, then smiled and ignored him. However, on the other side, Xuanxian Lu Biechen stopped moving forward and frowned. Although he had the upper hand in the fierce confrontation of calculation, the advantage was not obvious. A slight mistake could lead to a reversal at any time, so he shouldn't be distracted to consider too many other things. However, the appearance of Wang Lu made him have to think about it several times. Because he shouldn't be here at all. Although this world was only a world deduced by 2 peerless divine calculations and did not have the absolute power to destroy all living beings, this place was filled with the tyrannical thoughts of the 2 peak powerhouses. The mountains and rivers were fake, the misty peaks were also fake, but the power to create this gorgeous illusion from the darkness was by no means something that a mere king pill could bear. In this place, being washed back and forth by the 2 opposing forces was no different from suicide. Wang Lu was certainly not a person who was willing to commit suicide, so why did he come? What did he want to do by coming here? The unparalleled divine calculation was a one-on-one competition, and no external interference was allowed in the process. Even if Wang Lu had great magical power, he was not qualified to intervene at this time. In fact, what puzzled Lu Biechen the most was why the others let Wang Lu come in. The unparalleled divine calculation did not need a host, and there was no need for a waiter in the arena. From the beginning to the end, there should only be 2 people, and this third person should not appear at all. With a question in his mind, he would naturally lose a bit of calculation power, so he had to stop moving forward and then take half a step back. Because the opponent had begun to move forward, the wheel behind Supreme Tianluan accelerated its rotation. Countless fine lines penetrated into the earth from the wheel and began to push his world forward. Lu Biechen lost the initiative and felt that the world he calculated began to collapse. The vanguard could no longer resist, so he took half a step back. His calculation ability was better than his opponent's. As long as he regrouped, it would not be difficult to regain the initiative and suppress the opponent. However, after half a step, he subconsciously took another half step. He couldn't catch his breath just by moving half a step. Millions of characters surged through his mind, undergoing profound transformations. They turned into a surging torrent that surged towards his opponent, but he was unable to shake his opponent's momentum. His opponent, on the other hand, had merely seized the opportunity of his surprise to switch from defense to offense. By taking half a step forward, he seemed to possess boundless power. After half a step, another half step, 3 half steps in a row, he had already retreated more than 100 miles away. Most of the world of Supreme Tianluan, which had been swallowed from the midline, was spat out. Lu Biechen's heart sank. He knew that it was impossible for things to turn out well, and it wasn't very likely that he would be able to win this battle easily. Unfortunately, he didn't have the time to calculate these changes, so he couldn't hold back anymore. He planned to change to a different algorithm, one that he had not fully mastered yet. It had many flaws, but it was undoubtedly an efficient and powerful algorithm. In fact, at the beginning of the game he realized that he was weak in algorithm. When it came to computing ability, he was more than twice as good as Supreme Tianluan. However, the final result was almost equal. His advantage was only 10% and it was not stable. This should have been an unbelievable thing. He took the name Xuanxian not only because his primordial spirit was powerful, his mind was full, and his computing ability was unparalleled in the world. It was also because on the basis of absolute power, he also mastered thousands of different algorithms, which could perfectly adapt to the needs of any occasion. Most of his cultivation was used to improve his computing power and improve his algorithm. He was confident that no one in the world could be better at computing than him. Whether it was computing power or algorithm, he was undoubtedly the number 1 person in this world. However, Supreme Tianluan's algorithm was indeed above him. It was more efficient and had more changes. After 16,000 years of sleep, he missed a lot of things. He thought that after the age of chaos, 9 regions would completely wither. However, it seemed that after the surrounding spiritual energy gradually dried up and the law of the great Tao was deceived. These later generations opened up a different path and made great achievements. Unfortunately, there was no more time to feel these trivial things. Lu Biechen calmed himself down and prepared to use his killer move. In the huge and complicated showdown, suddenly switching the algorithm was tantamount to suicide in the eyes of many mathematicians. However, this algorithm could be regarded as a trump card by Xuanxian, who had mastered thousands of algorithms, so it naturally had its advantages. As long as he willed it, a brand new algorithm would replace it, and then it would display an even stronger computing efficiency, completely crushing his opponent. However, just as Lu Biechen switched the algorithm, there was a new change in the arena. The unexpected guest took a step forward. "Wang Lu, it's you again? You're just a mere king pill, do you still want to stir up the wind and rain here?" However, the next moment Lu Biechen was stunned. Because when Wang Lu took this step, the mountains and rivers behind him were also broken and the world was reborn. However, his world was different from that of Supreme Tianluan and Lu Biechen. Behind him was the surging world of mortals and all living beings. Thousands of cities rose from the ground, and hundreds of millions of people rested. In a flash, the map of the arena had changed from 2 strong people to 3 strong people at the same time. What does this mean? Does that little king pill really have such powerful computing power that he can participate in such a fight? And even if he really has this ability, it's not his turn to show it now. This is a one-on-one fight, not a big fight. At this moment, a lot of thoughts surged in Lu Biechen's mind. If it was other people who participated, he wouldn't have too many thoughts, but Wang Lu was indeed different. This little guy was too good at creating miracles, turning the impossible into the possible, and turning a 1-point chance of winning into a 10-point result. Lu Biechen had tried to build a mathematical model for him several times, but all of them ended in failure. This was a person who was very difficult to calculate, a variable that was very difficult to deal with. Although he could not play a big role in the face of a powerhouse like Supreme Dixian, in a fight between two strong people, he might really be able to tilt the balance of victory and defeat slightly. Other people might not pay much attention to Wang Lu, but Xuanxian Lu Biechen advocated planning before taking action. Before the start of the competition, he had carefully investigated Wang Lu and found out that when he was in the Shudan stage, he once went to the Western continent and borrowed the hand of an ancient sage to kill several saints. At that time he was only in his 20s, and his cultivation base was only at Shudan stage. Therefore, in the face of Wang Lu's strong intervention, Xuanxian Lu Biechen had to hesitate. His new algorithm had been prepared, but now it seemed that it still needed to be adjusted to include the intervention of Wang Lu. But this was beyond the scope of his ability. It was not difficult to include Wang Lu as a variable. After all, his strength was far above that of Wang Lu, even if Wang Lu now showed the strength of 3 strong people at the same time. However, there was still Supreme Tianluan, a Supreme Tianluan who was moving forward step by step. The moment of astonishment had caused irreparable consequences. Lu Biechen missed the critical opportunity to change the algorithm. In the face of the pressure of Supreme Tianluan, he had to take another step back. This step had already taken him out of the field. At the last moment, the pressure from the front was unusually strong. It almost doubled compared to the previous one, and it came so suddenly that he had no time to react. When he retreated, he intended to take only one step, but pushed by the pressure, this step was far farther than expected. When his foot landed, he was already standing outside the field. The outcome was set. Xuanxian Lu Biechen relaxed his mind. He didn't care much about the result of the game. Instead, because the result had been decided, he was able to divide his mind to calculate something that he had long been interested in calculating. In a flash, the calculation came to a result, and Lu Biechen couldn't help but laugh. Good calculation, good calculation. After sighing, Lu Biechen floated away, leaving hundreds of thousands of people outside the field looking at each other in dismay. Their hearts were filled with doubts, and even the cheers of victory were a little less confident. So, was this considered a win? Although the result of the victory was, of course, very good, the process was really not glorious enough. Wasn't it too unfair to force another person into the one-on-one competition? 2 against 1, even if they won, would the other side admit it? But just as they were puzzled, a young man in the audience stood up and shouted. His voice was not particularly loud, but it attracted everyone's attention in an instant because that voice was already familiar to people. People turned around and saw the figure with red and white striped clothes. It was actually Wang Lu. People were shocked because at the same time, there was also Wang Lu in the field. He led the mortal world and occupied half of the field. His momentum was no less than that of Supreme Dixian. However, the next moment, as Supreme Tianluan stepped out of the field, Wang Lu in the field disappeared. People were stunned for a moment and finally realized what had happened. It turned out that the uninvited guest in the field was Supreme Tianluan's camouflage from the beginning. Supreme Tianluan could calculate a world in the dark chaos with a supreme algorithm, so naturally, it was not difficult to calculate another Wang Lu. At the same time, the boundless mortal world behind Wang Lu when he appeared was obviously from Supreme Tianluan's calculation of the mortal world. Although the calculated Wang Lu would undoubtedly lack all kinds of charm compared to the real person, it was Wang Lu after all. In a hurry, it surprised Lu Biechen and missed a good opportunity, but it was enough. It was just that this method was not so much a calculation but more of a calculation. In this unparalleled calculation, Xuanxian and Lu Biechen calculated all things in the world and the derivation of good fortune, but Supreme Tianluan calculated Lu Biechen. He included his opponent in his calculation and used a scheme. Wasn't this a calculation? It was no wonder that Xuanxian and Lu Biechen would sigh with emotion after his defeat. Although it seemed to be unfair, who could say that it was not a victory to be able to beat Xuanxian with calculation? Xuanxian was good at calculation and was even better at calculation. Even Wang Lu, who liked to calculate people the most, said not to hit Xuanxian with crooked ideas. However, today Xuanxian was ruthlessly calculated by Supreme Tianluan and lost cleanly. He himself was willing to admit defeat and floated away. Realizing this, the cheers of the crowd became more confident. This was a victory, an undeniable great victory. This victory belonged to Supreme Tianluan, the entire Wanxian League, and at the same time, it also belonged to Wang Lu. Because as long as one was not a fool, it was not difficult to understand a truth. Supreme Tianluan alone, whether it was calculation or calculation, it was difficult to beat Xuanxian and Lu Biechen. But he won in the end, so where did the winning part come from? Of course it was Wang Lu. Chapter 662. The great victory of Supreme Tianluan against Swan Xian finally reversed the decline of the Wanxian League in the grand competition. After the victory, there was joy everywhere in the City of Immortals. Areas A and B were decorated with lanterns and colored banners, and major shops took the opportunity to offer discounts and promotions. The quick-witted businessmen had already made all kinds of products related to Supreme Tianluan. For example, Supreme Tianluan had personally certified the best quality medicinal pills, top-quality secret methods that had been praised by Supreme Tianluan, and imitation figurines made from the unique roulette of Supreme Tianluan. More than half of them were false advertisements. In his early years, before Supreme Tianluan succeeded in calculating the world of mortals, he was a well-known ascetic cultivator. How could he have so much time to come out to certify medicinal pills and comment on methods? 10,000 Arts sect was recognized as the richest sect in the entire immortal cultivation world. Any resources were almost never sought from outside, so why should he waste his time to come out? As for the imitation roulette figurines, it was purely a wishful thinking of profiteers, hoping that they would not encounter a disciple of 10,000 Arts sect who went out. However, in any case, these goods marked with the mark of Tianluan were very popular. The buyers of course knew the trick. Those who could settle in the City of Immortals were not idiots. Thus they did not buy it because they believed the advertising words but purely for the joy. We won. We are happy. We revel. Rich and willful. These people are crazy. The teenager in charge of the shop looked at the revelry outside the shop and could not help but click his tongue and then became depressed. As a seller, he should be overjoyed to encounter a day when the buyers collectively went crazy. Because the things that were difficult to sell on weekdays could be sold at an incredible price. The owners of several shops around him laughed until their lungs broke. Several worthless dishes, because they were urgently printed with the roulette icon of Supreme Tianluan, were sold at the price of 1 spirit stone each. How could there be such a good business in the world? Sparkling and translucent spirit stones flowed into his account like a steady stream of dirt. It was indeed a carnival, a feast. Alas, is that necessary? Didn't we just win a fight? The score is only 30 points. Before, we lost hundreds of games in a row, and the gap between the civil and martial skills is more than 2,000 points. And just today didn't we lose 2 small matches? What's there to be happy about? The young man's sigh wasn't loud, but the business owners on both sides of the street all had sharp ears and eyes. After hearing this they all sneered. Sour, continue being sour. Being ridiculed, the young man's face darkened slightly, but he did not refute. According to his usual temperament at this time, he would have already quarreled with the fat man on his left and the tall and skinny woman on his right. The little mouse had mingled in the marketplace since he was a child, but he had never had the concept of respecting the elderly. But today he didn't say a word and ate the other party's mockery. Because their laughter was not wrong. He was indeed sour, extremely sour. His left and right hands were making a lot of money, but he was just a businessman, but he could only sit and watch the market rise, unable to make a move. As for the reasons, it was very simple. After all, this shop wasn't his. He was in charge of the shop's daily operations, but he didn't have the final say in the important matters. The person who had the final say had personally told him not long ago that he was not allowed to participate in today's market. The goods in the shop were not allowed to have any relationship with Supreme Tianluan. This was, of course, a model of honest management. However, watching his peers become rich in a day, but he only had integrity and conscience as his companions, the torture in his heart was really indescribable. After a long time, the young man couldn't bear the torture, so he directly closed the shop and no longer operated it. What to buy and what to sell was not up to him, but as the only operator of the shop, he could always ask for sick leave in advance, right? From the shop back to his residence, Shu Si directly poured out his grievances to Dead Face. He didn't bother to mention the shop because not long ago when Dead Face told him to operate in good faith, they had already quarreled. And the result was clear at a glance, so naturally, there was no need to mention it again. However, the young man couldn't calm down, so he changed the topic and began to complain about this meaningless carnival. Supreme Tianluan did win, and this victory was indeed delightful. But how useful was a victory? For a victory, it was as if he had already won the grand competition. Wasn't that just deceiving himself? Listening to Shu Si's complaint, Dead Face didn't even raise his head, because what he said was nonsense. Indeed, this was just a victory, but at the same time the Wanxian League tasted 2 defeats. Immortal Luo Shui once again showed her unparalleled attainments in the fields of zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting, easily defeating the peerless zither master of the Wanxian League. In terms of points, today's Wanxian League lost. However, how could the grand competition be decided in 1 or 2 days? After a long time, Dead Face suddenly raised his head. From now on, prepare to collect goods related to Wang Lu, and they must be genuine. At the same time, in the courtyard of Immortal 5 area, Wang Lu gently put down the brush in his hand. Very good, in this way it's 3 consecutive victories. The momentum has already taken shape. As long as we continue to win in the next few games, the momentum will snowball and become smoother and smoother, and then, Wang Lu said and suddenly raised his head. Do you guys think it's necessary to stock up some of my exclusive goods from now on? Hai Yunfan sighed and said, if you have the energy, why don't you think about the next game? If you want money, why can't you get it with your power? Tsk, how can rape and adultery be lumped together? That being said, Wang Lu turned his attention back to the desk. However, after reading 2 documents, he felt that his hands were empty. He looked up and said, Little Hai, what about the next document? Hai Yunfan said, they're all here. I'll help you deal with them later. Don't look at me like that, no one wants to usurp power. It's just that as a secretary, I need to remind you that there are more things that need your attention now. No matter how you plan to take advantage of the next few games, you have to fight in person at the last pass. But so far, most of your energy has been used to deal with these paperwork, and the progress of your cultivation is not optimistic. Wang Lu was stunned when he heard this. Little Hai, I didn't expect you to be so concerned about my situation. Could it be that you recently quarreled with your wife so you fell in love with me? Unfortunately, I, the domineering chief planner, am not a person of that circle. Hai Yunfan sighed and said, even if I really quarreled with Fei Fei, it must be because you forcibly recruited me as a secretary, causing us to live apart. And from the beginning, it was you who spread the rumor that I was a person of that circle. Of course, I know that you always plan ahead and have a card up your sleeve. But as the main commander of the King Pill War, it's better for you to cultivate longer than shorter. There aren't that many jobs here that you can't do, so you don't need to waste too much time here. Wang Lu was silent for a while and also sighed. I also want to cultivate in seclusion immediately, but there are actually many jobs here that I can't do. Don't be fooled by the festive decorations outside. However, the situation was far from being optimistic. Just as everyone was celebrating, Fairy Luo Shui killed 2 of our generals in the other 2 arenas that were competing in zither skills. In terms of points, we didn't gain anything today. The next competition is scheduled to be held in 2 days, but there are still 3 small competitions to be held in these 2 days. Previously, we used all kinds of reasons to avoid them, but now we can't delay it any longer. And even if we win the competition in 2 days, we can't make up for the deficit of those 3 competitions. The situation is not so encouraging. Hai Yunfan said, the situation is indeed not optimistic, but Dixin's comprehensive strength is far better than ours, and they are carrying out a strategy of suppression at the beginning, so this situation is not surprising. So we designed the strategy of using points to exchange for time. First, we arranged some weaker players to participate in some competitions with fewer points. And the main force will take this opportunity to step up their cultivation and improve their strength, so that they can counterattack in the future. Your recent activity is also to boost the morale. When the morale reaches its peak, you will completely blow the horn of counterattack and send the main force players to the competition to win points. So, isn't it normal to lose points now? Wang Lu said, the problem is that the main force players have already started to play one after another. Hai Yunfan was suddenly shocked. What? In fact, in the original plan, I didn't intend to let the Wanxian League lose for a month in a row. At that time, the expectation was to try to maintain a balance in the competition. Even if the overall loss was more than win, at least it could maintain the fighting spirit. So the main force and the cannon fodder took turns to play. The cannon fodder made the opponent relax their vigilance, and the main force occasionally took advantage of the situation to advance and support the situation. But in fact, the first batch of the main force, which was pinned with high hopes, was almost defeated in the first battle. They were suppressed on the field and had no power to fight back. Their performance was no different from that of the cannon fodder, let alone support the situation. Do you think I deliberately baited the master of the Heaven Book building? Although it is indeed a good thing to take the opportunity to wipe out the evil spirits, wouldn't it be better if they could not even speak from the beginning? After listening to Wang Lu's explanation, Hai Yunfan felt a burst of dizziness in his mind, full of incredulity. During this time he was Wang Lu's working secretary. Most of the documents were presented to Wang Lu through his hands. It could be said that he was the clearest about Wang Lu's layout and plan. But he had never heard of such an inside story. Because I beat them at their own game in time, and I didn't have much confidence in them from the beginning. As soon as I saw that things were not going well, I immediately changed my mind and regarded it as part of the plan. I didn't tell anyone about this except for Supreme He 2 and a few other people, let alone in writing. So of course you won't know. But in general, I have been sending the main force to play for the past month, and most of the main force players have lost. Hai Yun Fan was silent for a long time. In this case, even if you personally win the King Pill battle in the future, what's the point of raising the morale to the peak? It's just to give everyone a fantasy of victory. Wang Lu said, "This is what I am doing now. I plan the schedule reasonably and design the lineup. Even if there is only a slim chance of winning, I will try my best to fight for it. This is what I am doing and the only thing I can do." Is there no one else who can do it except you? Of course there is. There is no lack of excellent bureaucratic talents among the elders in Heavenly Sage Hall. It is easy for them to handle some routine work, but can I let them take over now? Wang Lu smiled. Everyone knows that I am the host of the Wanxian League at present. If I suddenly change people, what will everyone think? Will the morale that has just been raised change? Hai Yun Fan felt a little heavier. Putting so many problems on you, a King Pill with less than 30 years of cultivation, will probably become the shame of the Wanxian League thousands of years later. Wang Lu said, on the contrary, thousands of years later, people will only praise the Wanxian League led by Supreme He 2 for knowing people well and not sticking to one pattern, choosing the most correct person at the most critical time. After that, Wang Lu stood up, stretched his wrist and said with a relaxed smile, "Don't worry, although the situation is indeed not optimistic, since I am here, the victory will definitely belong to us." Hai Yun Fan looked at Wang Lu's smile, only feeling that it was as bright as the sun, particularly dazzling. Chapter 663. The latest news: Supreme Tian Luan defeated Fairy Luo Shui again in the 96 chessboard match, winning 2 games and getting 30 points. In the bustling market of Area B3, a young cultivator was flying on a flying sword. His figure was like a ray of light. In an instant, he flew a few laps around the vast Area B3 and kept repeating the news of his victory. A moment later, the B3 area turned into a sea of joy. At the same time, the same plot played out in various areas of the City of Immortals. The news that Supreme Tian Luan defeated Fairy Luo Shui, who was proficient in zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting on the chessboard, made the whole City of Immortals burn. People shouted the name of Supreme Tian Luan with great enthusiasm. The only pity was that there were many games going on the same day, so the signboards arranged in various areas did not broadcast the game between Supreme Tian Luan and Fairy Luo Shui on the chessboard. Therefore, many people could not immediately learn the news of the victory, let alone see the heroic appearance of Supreme Tian Luan defeating Dixian. He's indeed the leader of the 5 uniques, he's really extraordinary. He defeated 2 Dixian in succession, and even the undefeated Fairy Luo Shui lost to him. In a restaurant in Human 5 area, a Yuanying stage cultivator sighed with emotion. He then poured himself a cup of immortal wine and raised it to the sky to toast Supreme Tianlun. Opposite him, an old friend of many years also raised his cup and said, "To Taoist Master Wang Lu." Upon hearing this, the Yuanying stage cultivator smiled and said, "Yes, I also want to salute Taoist Master Wang Lu. If there was no Taoist Master Wang Lu, I'm afraid Supreme Tianlun would not have won so easily." Yes, it is said that Taoist Master Wang Lu made a lot of effort in the preparation before the game. Alas, I don't know how he cultivated. In less than 30 years, his cultivation base reached the peak of King Pill, far above the fighting strength of King Pill, and he even has this omnipotent all-rounder. Alas, thinking of you and me in those days, it's really shameful. Haha, throughout the 100,000 years of 9 regions, only Immortal Qin and Great Ancestor Dishing could be better than him, right? When Emperor Shi Huang came out, the whole world was shocked. From the moment he obtained the Tao to the moment he ascended, it only took him a few decades to perfect his immortal cultivation. Incidentally, he also unified the immortal cultivation world of the 9 regions. Comparing with this kind of genius was simply asking for trouble. We just need to enjoy the victory that he has brought us. The 2 nascent soul cultivators looked at each other and smiled. They finished the wine in their cups, but just as they were enjoying themselves, they heard a cold snort from the next table. Isn't it too early to celebrate the victory? Supreme Tianlun won 2 battles, but he only got 30 points. However, the Wanxian League had lost 50 points in the previous 2 days. What was there to be happy about? What's more, the 2 victories were all thanks to Supreme Tianluan's unparalleled divination. If it was in other fields, Supreme Tianluan's divination would be useless, so what else could Wang Lu use to win? These words were like a bucket of cold water in the celebratory atmosphere. The 2 Yuanying stage cultivators put down the wine in their cups and turned to look at the next table. They saw a thin cultivator covered in a cloak. And when she saw him, the tipsy feeling from before was completely ruined. "Who the hell are you? How dare you talk nonsense here?" The thin cloaked man at the next table sneered. "Whether I'm talking nonsense or telling the truth, you should know it in your heart. Wang Lu is now nothing more than a performance, exaggerating a victory for you to see so that you really think that the situation is good and the final victory is beyond doubt. But in fact, people with sober minds can see that the situation has been deteriorating. Damn it, hiding your head and showing your tail, who the hell are you?" A Yuanying stage cultivator was extremely angry. He stood up and waved his hand. His true yuan turned into an invisible force and mercilessly lifted the cloak of the person at the next table. The thin person didn't seem to expect that this Yuanying stage cultivator dared to directly attack her under the influence of alcohol. Immediately, her cloak was lifted and she was caught off guard. There were many restaurants in this area, but for a long time, not many people dared to drink and make trouble here. Because there were also many golden-armored soldiers here. Using spells on others without permission was regarded as a violation of the rules of the City of Immortals and would be mercilessly punished by the golden-armored soldiers. Sure enough, less than 2 breaths after the old Yuanying stage cultivator made his move, 2 golden-armored soldiers appeared in the restaurant and restrained the old Yuanying stage cultivator. According to the rules of the City of Immortals, although his violation was not serious, just lifting a person's cloak, he could not be exempted from responsibility. He must spend a day in the small dark room. If he committed it again, the punishment would be increased by 1 level, 100 days in the small dark room. The small dark room in the City of Immortals was also famous. It was a place that was enough to make people with a stable Dao heart afraid. However, the old Yuanying stage cultivator turned a blind eye to this. His eyes were firmly locked on the person whose cloak was lifted by him, because he had recognized the identity of the other party. "Is you the maid of the master of heavenly book building, Mo Xiang?" The companion of the old Yuanying stage cultivator sneered and said, "It turns out to be the remnant of heavenly book building. No wonder you dare to talk nonsense here. Presumably you've already been bought by the Dixian and are willing to be a running dog." On that day, Taoist Master Wang Lu was merciful and didn't catch all of you accomplices. Unexpectedly, you didn't repent at all. Mo Xiang sneered and said, "Repent? What do I have to repent for? Do I regret saying the truth that you dare not say or even dare not listen to?" Wang Lu took the opportunity of the grand competition to crack down on the dissidents and could not tolerate the slightest dissenting voice. The whole city was cheering, but in fact the gap between the Wanxian League and the Dixian League was getting bigger and bigger. How could you still laugh? Such a stupid thing. I really can't find a few precedents in the history books. There are too many people like you who are willing to degenerate and even willing to be lowly. From today's grand competition to the 2 great wars of immortals and demons, and even the bloody war of the human race in the Age of Desolation, vicious villains who betrayed the interests of their own race have always emerged one after another, and none of them had a good end. A cultivator sitting in a corner of the restaurant suddenly stood up and scolded in a stern voice. His words were righteous and stern, which won the approval of the people in the restaurant. However, Mo Xiang was silent for a moment, and then she sneered and said, "I was wondering who could speak such high-sounding words so smoothly. Turns out it's Wang Lu's running dog Hai Yunfan. This eagerness to kneel down and lick the balls is actually in line with your sect's inheritance." 10,000 Arts sect often regarded themselves as wise, putting on a noble and elegant posture. However, since the establishment of the sect, they've always followed the leader and picked the leftover bones. Before the Age of Chaos, you fawned on Kunlun sect. Then when Xingjing sect flourished, you fawned on Xingjing sect again. Now even Wang Lu can order your supreme sect leader. Do dog-like slaves have the right to accuse me? Mo Xiang's words were extremely vicious, which made all the listeners frown. Hai Yunfan was so angry that he actually laughed, and his magical power swelled up. Today it was rare for Wang Lu to give him a day off, so that he could have the opportunity to accompany his wife to eat and go shopping in the City of Immortals, and live a sweet married life. As a result, he met this mad dog before he could even eat half of the meal. Were it not for his wife Yi Feifei to hold him back, this gentle young man would have directly stepped forward with his sword. Seeing this, Mo Xiang laughed even more, and her laughter was full of desolation. You gathered here because you believe that Wang Lu can bring you victory. But don't forget that Wang Lu is just a king pill, far from omnipotent as you imagine. If he really has the ability to win for the Wanxian League, he would not have allowed the Wanxian League to fail more than 100 times in the past month. With his character, if he has any ability, he should have used it long ago. Allowing the Wanxian League to lose in a row only shows that he is at his wit's end, and now he is just struggling at death's door. Do you really think that those King Pill Yuanian cultivators who were selected as the main force could advance by leaps and bounds and reverse the situation after just a few months of training? Based on what? Do you think that in the past month or so only the Wanxian League is willing to work hard, while the Dixian cultivators are stagnant? They are also making progress. By adapting to the rules of the grand competition, they continue to exert their strength to the extreme. The so-called classification competition is a joke from the beginning, because the speed at which the Dixian cultivators adapt to the rules is much faster than that of a group of King Pill Yuanian cultivators. The longer the time, the farther away you will be from victory. Such a simple truth, but you actually deceive yourselves and turn a blind eye to it. Aha, if it were someone else they might be stupid, but is Wang Lu also stupid? I'm afraid that he has already secretly reached a deal with the Dixian cultivators, selling you stupid low-level cultivators in exchange for future benefits. And he too and Tianluan are all Wang Lu's accomplices, so they tolerate his unscrupulous behavior. These words were like the cold winter wind whistling past, but no one in the restaurant refuted it. Since the master of heavenly book building, Supreme Ting Feng, was broken by Aya's sword and the scandal was exposed, this long-standing high-rank sect declined at an alarming rate. The elders and disciples fled one after another, and the remaining ones also showed a sense of dejection. The sect no longer had the previous determination to make progress. In this way, in just 2 or 3 years, heavenly book building would be removed from the list of high-rank sects, and it would be difficult for them to make a comeback in thousands of years. As a remnant of heavenly book building, after losing her master, Mo Xiang had no one to rely on. Her mind became increasingly distorted, and the gentle and elegant beauty gradually degenerated into ferocious and mournful. However, Mo Xiang's ferocious expression did not hinder her sharp words, which went straight into people's hearts. What she said seemed absurd, but for a while it was difficult for people to refute. Therefore, the restaurant maintained an indescribable silence. Until a slightly drunken laughter came. A group of idiots, they can actually be frightened by such a fallacy. Forget about other people, but Hai Yunfan, you work with Wang Lu every day and have been in contact with him for so many times. Haven't you learned a little bit of his sharp tongue? With that, a woman full of the smell of wine and meat walked down the stairs slowly while shaking a wine bottle. She looked 23 or 24 years old, wearing a simple and somewhat crude plain dress. Her facial features were delicate, and her temperament was natural and unrestrained, almost sloppy. The woman's cultivation base was around Yuanying's stage. She held a wine bottle in her right hand and a string of beads on her left wrist, showing her identity as a Zen cultivator. Hai Yunfan was stunned for a moment. Zen Master Guru? You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.